There is a statue standing in the middle of a bay in a city that did not exist when the story you know was still being told. It is a tall statue of a young man with a staff and an arrow on his brow, calm and watchful, looking out over water and steel and a skyline of a country that had no name while he was alive. And the strangest part, the part I keep coming back to, is that the girl who is his own soul reborn will one day stand in the shadow of that statue, having never once met the man it honors because he died in the very same year she was born. That is where all of this is going, and almost nobody sits with what it actually means. Tonight we are going through every character from Avatar, the Last Airbender, and what became of them after the war ended, all the way to the quiet ends of their lives. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your shoulders drop, and if you haven't subscribed to Ember yet, it really helps us keep making these long ones for you. Let's begin where the whole story begins and ends, with Aang. When the last battle's over, when the comet has burned itself out of the sky, and the war that lasted 100 years is finally, impossibly done, Aang is 12 years old. He is a child who has just carried the weight of a whole, broken world on a set of very small shoulders. And the thing that is easy to forget, watching him grin at his friends in that tea house in the final minutes, is that he still has a long life ahead of him, and that life is going to be far harder and far shorter than a boy that age has any reason to expect. Because here's the truth the series never pauses to spell out for you. Aang does not get the long, slow, contented old age you might imagine for him. He gets something more complicated than that, and it starts with the 100 years he spent frozen in the ice. Think back to how he ended up in that iceberg in the first place. He ran away, he got caught in a storm at sea, and in a moment of pure terror, the Avatar state took over and encased him and his sky bison in a shell of ice to keep them alive. And that is exactly what it did. It kept him alive. But it did not let him rest. For a century, he was suspended in that ice in the Avatar state. And by the reckoning of the world of Avatar, that century did not come free. The Avatar state kept his body from dying, but it burned through his life force to do it. When Katara and Sokka chip him out of that iceberg, he is biologically 12. But the clock on his actual lifespan has already been quietly wound forward by 100 years. He is, in a sense, the show only lets you understand much later, already living on borrowed time from the moment you meet him. So what happens to Aang after the finale, in the decades the animated series never shows you, is that he becomes exactly the man that Child promised he would be, and then he dies far too young. After the war, he does not simply retire into peace. He and Fire Lord Zuko and the Earth King sit down together and try to solve the problem the war left behind, which is that the Fire Nation had spent 100 years planting colonies deep inside the Earth Kingdom, and generations of ordinary people now lived in towns that were neither one nation nor the other. You cannot simply march those families out of their homes. You also cannot pretend the occupation never happened. That knot is the first great work of Aang's adult life, and we will come back to how it gets solved because the answer to it is one of the biggest things that changed in this world after the credits rolled. For now, the thing to hold on to is that grown-up Aang spends his life doing what the child always did. He looks for the solution nobody else can see, the one where you do not have to destroy anyone to win. He marries Katara. That much the series openly promises you in its final image, and the marriage is real and it lasts. Together they have 3 children, and I will give you their names now because those 3 children carry this entire world forward into the next era. The eldest is a son named Bumi, after Aang's oldest friend. The middle child, their only daughter, is a waterbender named Kaya, after Katara's mother. And the youngest is a boy named Tenzin, who is born an airbender, the first new airbender by blood in 100 years, and who grows up to carry the whole weight of the air nomad revival on his back the way his father once carried the war. That youngest son is the closest thing Aang has to an heir to who he was. And there is something a little sad tucked inside that, because it means Aang looked at his 3 children and saw only one of them able to inherit the culture he was the last living piece of. Read one way, the show is telling you that even a happy family cannot fully undo a genocide. The air nomads are not restored simply because Aang had children. Only one of those children is an airbender, and the true revival of the airbenders will not come until long after Aang is dead and gone. And Aang does die, and this is the fact that catches people off guard every single time. Of the friends who fought the war together, the whole core group you spent 3 seasons loving, Aang is the first to go. He dies of natural causes at the age of 66, in the year the world calls 153 after the genocide, which is a little over half a century after the war ended. 66, for an ordinary person, that is not a full life, and for the Avatar, whose past incarnations often lived well past 100, it is startlingly early. His predecessor Roku lived to 70, and the great Kyoshi is said to have lived past 200. Aang, the boy who saved the world, gets 66 years, because the 100 years in the ice were always going to be taken back out of the far end of his life. The child who skipped a century paid for it with his old age. Here is the detail that truly stops me every time I lay it out. In that same year that Aang dies, 153, a baby girl is born in the Southern Water Tribe. Her name is Korra, and she is the next Avatar, Aang's own soul continuing on into a new body, a new element, a new life. The rule of this world is simple and merciless. A new Avatar is only born when the last one dies. So Korra exists because Aang died. The old Avatar and the new one never share a single day of life. Aang never meets the child who is, in the deepest sense the world allows, himself. He dies before any of his grandchildren are born. He dies before the city he helped build grows into its skyline. He builds a world and then leaves it. The way he was always, from the very first episode, a person just passing through. What he leaves behind is enormous. He spends his adult decades rebuilding what the war destroyed. He works to restore balance between the nations and between the human and spirit worlds. He rediscovers something that was thought lost, a wild herd of sky bison and a colony of winged lemurs hidden away in the mountains, which means the flying bison, the animal everyone believed had died out with his people, survive into the future because Aang went looking, and he helps found an entirely new nation out of those tangled old colonies, a place built on the idea that people of every nation could live in one city as equals. That city becomes the beating center of the world that comes after. He does not live to see most of what it becomes. And then, long after his death, he does come back, just not in the way anyone expects. In the era of the next Avatar, Aang appears as a spirit, a guide, a voice from the other side of the veil, helping Korra find her footing, the way the past Avatars always helped their successors. For a while he is there, patient and gentle, exactly as you remember him. But even that gets taken away, and this is one of the harder truths of everything that came after, so hold on to it, because we will come back to it much later when everything else is in place. There comes a moment in Korra's story when her connection to all of her past lives, to Aang, to Roku, to Kyoshi, to every Avatar who came before, is severed completely and permanently. After that, Aang cannot appear to her anymore. The link between the old souls and the new one is cut, and it does not come back. So the boy who was the last Airbender ends in the very long view as a light that finally goes fully dark, one last time, generations after his body was gone. It is a quiet and enormous kind of loss, and the show lets it happen almost without comment. That is Aang, first to arrive in your heart, first of them to leave the world. Everything else that happened after the war happened in the space he cleared and then vacated. So let's stay close to him for a moment longer and turn to the person who was beside him for all of it, the girl from the Southern Water Tribe who found him in the ice. Katara ends the series as the emotional spine of the whole group, and she stays that for the rest of a very long life. If Aang was the first of them to die, Katara is, in the end, one of the last of them still standing, and there is a strange loneliness built into that which the show only shows you if you go looking. After the war, she marries Aang, and she becomes a great deal more than the Fire Lord's counterpart or the Avatar's wife. Though she is both, she becomes, in her own right, the finest waterbending master and healer of her age. Remember that this is a girl who, at the very start of her story, was the only waterbender left in the entire Southern Water Tribe, taught by no one, practicing alone with a technique she half-invented from memory and stubbornness. By the end of her life, she is the master that others are sent across the world to learn from. The tribe that had been ground down to almost nothing by the war is rebuilt, and Katara is at the center of that rebuilding, a matriarch in the truest sense, the person the whole community grows up around. She raises her 3 children in the south, and she outlives her husband by a long, long time. Aang dies at 66, and Katara keeps going for decades after him. By the time Korra is a young woman, some 70 years after the war ended, Katara is around 85 years old, a white-haired elder, still practicing, still healing, still the wise woman of the Southern Water Tribe. And in a turn that has a beautiful symmetry to it, she becomes the one who trains the new avatar in waterbending. Korra, the girl born the year Aang died, learns to bend water from the same woman who taught Aang to love. Katara is the living thread that ties the two avatars together across the gap that death opened between them. She could not give Korra the man himself, but she could give her the water and the memory and the stories. I find her later years honestly moving and a little heavy if you stop to think about the arithmetic of them. Katara is around 89 years old by the close of Korra's own story, and by then she has buried her husband and she has buried her brother. She has watched a new generation, her own children and grandchildren, grow into the leaders of a world she helped make. She spends her last chapters as a widow and a grandmother and a keeper of memory, the last one who remembers the war from the inside, the last one who was there in the ice when the whole thing started. There is a version of this ending that is warm and full, surrounded by family, and there is a version that is quietly solitary, the survivor who outlasts nearly everyone she loved. The honest answer is that it is both at once, and the show lets both be true. She is not shown to die within the story we have. She is alive at the very end of the tale we are given, old and frail and unbroken. The girl from the Southern Water Tribe who found a boy in an iceberg and never really let the world forget him. Before we leave her, one comic canon thread worth naming because it fills in the years right after the war. In the post-series graphic novels, which the creators oversaw and which count as canon, Katara does not simply settle down. She travels back to the south with Sokka and finds their home transformed, industrializing, tangled up in a fresh conflict between the old ways and new outside influence. And she has to work out what her tribe should become. She also has her own smaller adventures, including a story that returns her to a run-in with pirates from her early days. But the through line of all of it is the same. Katara spends her life holding a family and a tribe and a memory together. And she does it for longer than almost anyone else in this story gets to do anything. So that is Katara, the one who endures. Now to the person whose absence hangs over her old age more than any other, the brother who was beside her from the very first scene, and whose ending is one of the genuine mysteries this world never solved. Sokka is, for my money, the character whose after-story hits the hardest, precisely because of how little of it we are given. Let me lay out what we actually know, because the gap in it is the whole point. After the war, Sokka does not fade into the background as the guy without bending. He becomes a leader in the fullest sense. He is made chief of the Southern Water Tribe, following in his father's footsteps, guiding the same rebuilt community his sister is helping to raise. And beyond the South, he becomes something even bigger. When the new nation is founded out of the old colonies, when Republic City rises and needs a government, Sokka is there at the founding. He becomes one of the very first members of the United Republic Council, the governing body of the new fifth nation. The boy who spent the early episodes being the comic relief, the plan guy, the one without a drop of bending in him, grows up to help write the constitution of an entire country. He earns his place at the center of the world purely on wit and will. And I think that is exactly the ending his whole arc was building toward. He never needed to bend, he needed to be listened to, and by the end, the leaders of the world listened to him. We get one last confirmed glimpse of him, and it is a good one, and it is heartbreaking in hindsight. Around 58 years after the war, when Sokka is 74 years old, he is there, still fighting, still protecting people, when a group of dangerous benders tries to kidnap the infant Korra from the Southern Water Tribe. Old man Sokka, in his 70s, helps defend a baby who is the reincarnation of his best friend. That is the last we ever definitively see of him alive. And after that, the record simply goes quiet. Here is the mystery, and it is a real one, not something I am inflating. Sokka dies. The canon is very clear that by the time Korra's story begins, Sokka is gone. He is the second of the core group to die, after Aang. But the story never tells you how he died, and it never tells you exactly when. There is no death scene, no illness named, no accident described, no year marked. He is alive at 74 defending baby Korra, and then at some point in the following years he is simply not there anymore, and no one on screen ever explains it. For a character this beloved, that silence is deafening, and fans have never fully made peace with it. People have theorized about it endlessly, and I want to be careful here because that is all any of it is. Theory. Nothing official confirms a cause. The honest, slightly painful answer is that we do not know how Sokka died. The world just moved on without telling us, the way the world often does with the people who hold everything together and never ask for the spotlight. What I keep sitting with is the shape of it. Sokka spends his life being the one who plans for everything, who thinks 3 steps ahead, who has a contingency for the contingency. And his own ending is the one thing in this whole world that was left without explanation, an unplanned blank. There is something almost unbearably fitting and unfair about that. The man who always had an answer gets an exit with no answer at all. If you want a reason, the fans of this show still ache a little at his name, that is it. Not the way he died, because we do not have it, but the fact that a character who gave the story so much was given so little in return at the end. So we leave Sokka the way the world left him, mid-stride, still useful, still funny, still guarding someone smaller than himself, and then gone into a silence the story never filled. Let's turn now to the friend who could feel the whole world through the soles of her feet, and who arguably shaped the future more than any of them. Toph Beifong is the one whose afterstory is the biggest, and I mean that almost literally, because the fingerprints she leaves on the world are enormous. If you want proof that a supporting character can outgrow the whole cast, watch what happens to the little blind runaway from the wealthy family after the war ends. Start with the thing she is most famous for, and let me get it exactly right, because I know people watch closely, and I know this one has been botched before. Toph invented metalbending. She is the first person in the history of the world to bend metal, and the way she discovered it was not a training exercise, and it was not a lucky accident in some Fire Nation machine. She worked it out while she was trapped, imprisoned inside a metal cage by 2 Earth Kingdom bounty hunters, Xin Fu and Master Yu, who had been hired by her own parents to drag her back home. Locked in that metal box, cut off from the earth she needed to see, she felt her way into the tiny particles of rock still trapped inside the refined metal, and she bent those and she tore her way out. That is the birth of metal bending. It comes out of captivity and defiance, a girl refusing to be caged by the people who thought they owned her. And there is not a scrap of Fire Nation anywhere in it. Hold that, because everything she builds afterward grows from that single act. After the war, Toph does not sit still, because Toph has never in her life sat still. She takes the art she invented and she teaches it. She founds a metal bending academy, the first school of its kind, and she trains a new generation of students to do the thing that only she could do. She is no longer the only metal bender in the world. She becomes the source of an entire discipline, a whole branch of bending that would go on to reshape warfare, policing, architecture, everything. In the comics that fill in these years, we see her wrestling with what that means, and we even see her reconcile in her thorny, guarded way with her own father, the man whose control she ran away from as a child. The girl who refused to be a delicate Beifong daughter becomes the founder of a Beifong legacy on entirely her own terms. Then she goes to the new city. When Republic City rises, Toph moves there, and she becomes its first chief of police. She founds the metal-bending police force, an entire law enforcement built around the art she invented in a cage. Officers in metal armor who can pull cables and bend the city itself to keep order. Think about the journey in that. A blind 12-year-old teaches herself an impossible skill to escape a prison, and by the end of her career, that same skill is the backbone of the police force of the greatest city in the world. She goes from being caged by the law her parents bought to being the law. I do not think there is a bigger single arc in the whole afterstory than that one. Toph also has a family, and it is complicated in a way that feels very true to her. She has 2 daughters by 2 different fathers, and the relationships that produce them do not last. The elder daughter is named Lin, whose father was a man named Kanto, and Lin grows up to follow directly in her mother's footsteps as chief of police of Republic City, a stern, iron-spined officer who is one of the central figures of the era that follows. The younger daughter is named Suyin, called Su, and she takes the family gift in a wildly different direction. Su founds an entire city out of metal, a gleaming, self-designed utopia called Zaofu, the crowning architectural achievement of metal bending, a place that could only exist because her mother once bent iron in a cage. So Toph's 2 daughters split her legacy neatly between them, one taking the law and the order, the other taking the art and the creation, and the 2 of them do not get along, which is about as Beifong an outcome as you could imagine. And here is the turn that I actually did not expect the first time I learned it. Toph, of all people, all muscle and stubbornness and no patience for anything she could not feel through her feet, The one who mocked spiritual mumbo-jumbo at every opportunity ends her life as a hermit in a swamp. In her old age, she retires from the police, retires from the city, retires from her family's endless feuding, and she goes to live alone in the foggy swamp, that strange, spiritually charged tangle of a place, where she becomes deeply, almost eerily attuned to the natural world. When the next avatar finally tracks her down there, Toph is a tiny, ancient, cackling old woman, more spiritually connected than she ever let on she cared to be, having made a kind of peace by simply removing herself from everything she built. She is alive at the very end of it all, old and gleeful and entirely herself. She outlives most of them, tucked away in the mud and the roots, still able to feel every footstep for miles. What gets me about Toph's ending is how it inverts everything she started as. She began as a rich girl smothered by a family that wanted to keep her small and safe and hidden. She spent her youth as loudly and publicly as a person can, inventing arts, founding schools, running a police force, raising warring daughters. And then, having built more than almost anyone, she chose to disappear, alone, into the quietest place she could find, and she was happy there. The runaway spent her whole life running toward the world, and at the end she ran all the way through it and out the other side into stillness. Now to the boy who spent 3 seasons chasing our heroes and became, in the end, the one who held an empire together. Zuko is the character whose afterstory lasts the longest, and I do not just mean that his life is long, though it is. I mean that of everyone in the core group, Zuko is the one you can follow the furthest into the future. All the way from a scarred banished prince to a white-bearded grandfather in Korra's era. Still alive, still fighting, still trying to do the right thing decades after everyone else has aged and gone. If you want the single through line of Zuko's whole existence, it is a man trying, over and over, to be better than the family that made him. And the astonishing thing is how long he keeps having to try. He is crowned Fire Lord at the very end of the war, a teenager taking the throne of the nation that just spent 100 years burning the world. There is a thing nobody warns you about being the good Fire Lord. It is arguably harder than winning the war was, because now Zuko has to be the one to undo the machine his great-grandfather built. And that machine has deep roots, and a lot of his own people like the Empire and do not want to give it up. The years right after his coronation are not a victory lap. They are exhausting, dangerous, and lonely. The first great crisis of his reign is the colonies. As I mentioned, the Fire Nation had planted towns deep inside the Earth Kingdom for 100 years, and now there are whole cities of people who were born there, who know no other home, and who happen to be Fire Nation citizens living on Earth Kingdom soil. There is a movement to remove them all, to restore the old borders by force, and at first Aang and Zuko both support it. And then Zuko sees a colony full of families who have built real lives, intermarried, blended cultures, and he cannot do it. He changes his mind, and it nearly breaks his friendship with Aang, and it sets the Avatar and the Fire Lord on opposite sides of a genuine moral problem with no clean answer. That crisis is the heart of the first post-war comic, and the way it resolves shapes the entire future of this world more than almost anything else that follows, because out of that unresolvable knot comes the decision to make those blended colonies into something entirely new, which is where Republic City is born. But we will come to the city itself in its own time. For Zuko, the lesson of those early years is that being the good king means constantly making choices that half your people will hate. There is a detail from that first crisis that tells you everything about how frightened Zuko was of himself in those days. He goes to Aang and he makes his friend promise something terrible. He makes Aang promise that if he, Zuko, ever begins to turn into a tyrant like his father, Aang will end him. He is so afraid of the Ozai inside his own blood that he arranges his own execution in advance, just in case. And in the same period, desperate for guidance on how to actually rule, he starts secretly visiting the one person who knows what sitting on that throne feels like, which is his imprisoned father. He goes down into the prison and asks Ozai for advice on how to be Fire Lord, and you can feel how badly that corrupts the air around him. A good young man sneaking off to drink counsel from the poisoned well because he does not know who else to ask. That is Zuko in the years right after the war, powerful, principled, and profoundly alone. Terrified that the worst version of himself is only one bad decision away. He does not stay that lost, though. Over the decades, Zuko becomes exactly the ruler the world needed. He reigns for a very long time, around 67 years, and that long reign is a period of relative peace. the slow, unglamorous work of turning a war machine into a normal country. He hunts down the remnants of his father's loyalists. He deals with secret societies that want the old empire back. He rebuilds relationships with nations his people spent a century burning. It is not clean, and it is not easy, and the comics are full of him getting it wrong and correcting course. But he keeps at it for a lifetime. And the Fire Nation he hands on is not the one he inherited. Now, his personal life. I have to be careful here because this is a place where a lot of people state as fact something the canon never actually confirms. Zuko has a daughter, an only child named Izumi, who eventually inherits the throne. But who Izumi's mother is, who Zuko ultimately married, is deeply not confirmed anywhere in the canon. The obvious guess is Mai, his girlfriend from the show, and we will get to Mai and how tangled that thread becomes. But I want to be honest with you rather than tidy. The comics show Zuko and Mai breaking up and partly reconciling and never quite resolving, and the canon simply never states who he settled down with or who the mother of his heir was. So if you have ever heard someone say confidently that Zuko married Mai and they lived happily ever after, that is not something the story ever tells you. It is a reasonable hope. It is not a fact. What is a fact is Izumi and that Zuko raised a daughter capable of ruling a nation. And then, in his later years, Zuko does something that mirrors his own uncle in a way I find quietly beautiful. He gives up the throne. About 67 years into his reign, an old man now, he abdicates, and he hands the Fire Nation to his daughter Izumi, and he becomes something he was never allowed to be as a young man, which is free. He becomes a roving ambassador, traveling the world to spread peace and to help wherever the balance is threatened, no longer bound to a palace. In his last decades, he is out there in the world, an old man in the 90s, riding a dragon. Yes, a dragon. This is my favorite detail about old Zuko, so let me give it to you properly. Dragons were thought to be extinct, hunted to nothing by his own ancestors, and Zuko himself once believed he had seen the very last of them. But the dragons survived, hidden, and in his old age Zuko has one of his own, a companion named Druk, and he flies around the world on the back of a dragon into his 90s, still showing up wherever he is needed, still standing between innocent people and the forces that would hurt them. The angry, scarred boy who spent his youth being told he was worthless ends his life as a serene old master on a dragon, one of the oldest living heroes of a bygone age. Still, after all those decades trying to do the right thing, he is around 91 years old and still swinging by the end of the franchise, one of the very last of the core group left alive, right there beside Katara and Toph at the far edge of the story. If Aang's ending is a light going out too soon, Zuko's is the opposite. It is a long, hard-won dusk, a man who was handed the worst possible inheritance and spent an entire lifetime patiently and imperfectly refusing to become it. Now to the person who made all of that possible, the uncle who never gave up on him, and whose ending is the strangest and most peaceful of anyone's. Iroh gets, I think, the most beautiful ending in the entire story, and it is beautiful precisely because it is not really an ending at all. Before we get to it, one thing I have to clear up, because the years after the war hold two men named Iroh, and people mix them up constantly. There is Iroh the uncle, the old general, the tea-loving Grand Lotus you know and love. And then, generations later, in Korra's time, there is a young man also named Iroh, a general in the United Forces who is Zuko's grandson, named in honor of the uncle. Two completely different people. When I talk about Iroh's fate here, I mean the uncle, the real one, the one who sang to a burning ember and told his nephew that pride is not the opposite of shame. After the war, Iroh gets the retirement he always wanted, and it is small and perfect and exactly his size. He reopens his tea shop, the Jasmine Dragon, in the upper ring of Ba Sing Se, and he goes back to being what he always secretly was underneath the general's armor. A man who wanted nothing more than to pour tea for people and play a good game and enjoy the company of friends. He remains the Grand Lotus of the Order of the White Lotus, that secret society of masters that crosses all four nations and works quietly to preserve knowledge and balance so he is not idle, but the shape of his days is a teapot and a warm room and the smell of jasmine. After everything the man lost, and he lost a great deal, including his own son, that is the ending he earns. But Iroh's real ending, the one that sets him apart from everyone else in this story, is what happens when his life ends, because Iroh does not simply die the way the others do. Iroh was, all along, far more spiritually advanced than he ever let on. He is one of the few people in the world who has traveled to the spirit world and back and understood it. And when the time comes for him to go, he does not just pass away. He uses that spiritual mastery to leave his body deliberately and cross over fully into the spirit world, to reside there permanently, awake, aware himself. He does not fade, he relocates. He goes to live among the spirits, and of course, being Iroh, he sets up a place to serve them tea. He becomes a kind of gentle fixture of the other side, an old man in a serene corner of the spirit world, brewing tea for wandering spirits and lost souls, exactly as he did in Ba Sing Se, only now on the far side of death. And because he is over there, awake and whole, he can still turn up when he is needed. Generations later, when Aang's own children go looking for guidance in the spirit world, it is Iroh they find, unchanged, warm, wise, pouring tea, ready to help. When the new Avatar herself is lost in the spiritual dark, Iroh is there. He becomes, in the truest sense, a permanent light on the other side, a grandfather to the whole world who never really left, only stepped through a door and held it open. Of everyone whose fate we trace tonight, he is the only one who found a way to make death itself into a kind of continuing hospitality. There is something in that which I find almost unbearably moving, and it is this. Iroh spent his early life as a conqueror, a man who marched an army to the walls of Ba Sing Se and tried to take the city by force. He failed, and he lost his son in the trying, and that grief broke the general and slowly made the man. And the man he became spent the rest of his existence on both sides of death, doing the exact opposite of conquering. He gave, he poured, he waited, he welcomed. The general who once besieged the great city ends up as an old spirit offering tea to anyone who wanders by, asking nothing, holding the door. If you ever wondered what wisdom actually looks like in this world, it is not a technique and it is not a philosophy. It is a man who chose over and over to be kind, and who was so good at it that not even dying could stop him. Now to the sister and the hardest question in the whole afterstory, which is what becomes of Azula. Azula is the one the show never fixes, and I want to be honest that this is by design, not by neglect. If you came here hoping to hear that Azula got better, got well, got a clean redemption to match her brothers, I have to gently tell you that the canon refuses to give you that. And it refuses on purpose, and I think it is the braver choice even though it is the harder one to sit with. When we last see her in the series, Azula is broken. The perfect, terrifying prodigy has come completely apart, betrayed by her own mind, weeping and screaming and chained on the ground while her brother takes the throne. That is where the show leaves her, and the comics pick her up not long after, and they do not offer easy comfort. In the years right after the war, Azula's mental state keeps deteriorating. She is haunted, quite literally in her own perception, by hallucinations of their mother, Ursa, the mother whose love she believed she never had. Zuko has her institutionalized, cared for, watched over, because he cannot bear to simply abandon his sister even after everything, and that instinct of his to keep reaching for her becomes one of the quiet aches that runs through his whole life. At one point, Zuko releases her because he needs her. He is trying to find their mother, and Azula is the only one who might hold a piece of the puzzle, so he brings her along. And for a while, the two of them travel together, and you can feel him hoping, against all the evidence, that maybe the journey will bring her back to herself. It does not. Azula is brilliant and wounded and utterly unable to trust the family reaching out to her. And by the end of that search, she flees, choosing the wilderness and her own broken freedom over her brother's care. She vanishes into the wild rather than accept a hand. She does not stay gone. Later, she resurfaces at the head of a group of Ozai loyalists who want to tear Zuko down and restore the old order, and for a while it looks like she is simply the villain again, plotting her father's return. But the truth of what she is doing turns out to be stranger and sadder than that. Her real aim, it is revealed, was never to put Ozai back on the throne. It was to test Zuko, to frighten and pressure and sharpen him, to force him to become a harder, stronger, more ruthless Fire Lord, because in her own fractured logic she believed a soft king would be destroyed, and she was, in some twisted way, trying to make her brother strong enough to survive. It is manipulation and cruelty, and buried underneath, something that looks disturbingly like a damaged form of care. That is Azula in a sentence. Even her attempts to help come out shaped like knives. And that is essentially where the canon leaves her. There are later stories that follow her further into the spiritual and the psychological that keep her arc open and unresolved. A woman still wrestling with the wreckage of how she was raised, never cleanly healed, and never simply written off as a monster. She is not shown in Korra's era at all, and given the timeline she would be long gone by then. But within the window we actually get, Azula's story just stays raw. There is no cure, no tidy redemption arc, no moment where she weeps and is forgiven and made whole. What gets me about that, and I think it is the point, is that it is the most honest thing the show could have done. Azula is not a puzzle with a solution. She is a child who was turned into a weapon by a father who valued her only as long as she was useful and terrifying. And you do not simply heal that with a hug and a graphic novel. The show respects her too much to pretend it is easy. Her ending is an open wound, and it stays open, and I think that is the truest mercy the story could offer her. Now to the woman at the center of all of that pain, the mother both of them lost, whose fate is one of the strangest secrets the whole franchise ever revealed. Ursa is the great missing person of the original series. Throughout the show, Zuko is haunted by the mother who vanished when he was a boy, banished from the palace on the night his grandfather died, gone without a trace, and the series ends without ever telling you where she went or whether she was even alive. The very last shot of Zuko in the original run is him standing in his father's cell, asking Ozai where his mother is. And the answer to that question, when it finally comes in the comics, is one of the strangest reveals this franchise ever produced, because it does not answer with a location. It answers with a spirit and a stolen face and a memory deliberately erased. Here is what happened to Ursa. After she was banished from the capital, she did not simply flee to some hiding place and wait. She went back toward the small village she came from, and along the way she made a bargain with a powerful spirit called the Mother of Faces, a being who can give a person an entirely new face. Ursa asked for two things. She asked for a new face, so that no one could find the disgraced princess she had been, and she asked for something far more drastic. She asked the spirit to take away her memories, all the painful ones, her marriage to Ozai, the palace, even her own children. She wanted the agony of that whole life lifted out of her, and the spirit granted it. Ursa was remade. She became a new woman with a new face and no memory of the son and daughter she left behind. And she took a new name, Noriko, and she built a fresh life free of all that grief. And in that new life, she finally got the love she had been denied. Long before Ozai, before the palace, before any of it, Ursa had loved a man from her village named Ikem, a gentle actor, and she had been forced to leave him to marry into the royal family. Ikem, it turns out, had also gone to the Mother of Faces and received a new face and a new name, Norin. And so the two lost lovers, both remade, both hidden behind new faces, found each other again in that quiet village and married. The life they should have had all along finally arriving decades late. Together they had a daughter. And this is the reveal that reframes the whole family. That daughter is named Kie, and Kie is Zuko, and Azula's younger half-sister. Somewhere out in a small village, the two royal siblings had a little sister growing up in a loving home, the childhood neither of them ever got. When Zuko finally tracks his mother down, she does not know him. He is standing in front of the woman he has spent his whole life aching to find, and she looks at him with a stranger's polite confusion, because the mother is quite literally not in there anymore, erased by her own choice. And the resolution of it is left, achingly, up to Ursa herself. The Mother of Faces can restore her true face and her true memories, but only if she wants them back. And wanting them back means willingly taking the pain back too, the grief, the guilt, the loss, everything she paid the spirit to remove. She has to choose whether to remember her children. And she chooses to remember. She takes back her true face and her real name and all the sorrow that comes with it. Because a life without her son in it, even a peaceful one, is not a life she is willing to keep. That choice, A mother deciding that the pain of loving you is worth more than the comfort of forgetting you is one of the most quietly devastating things in the whole canon. So Ursa's fate, in the end, is a happy one, or as happy as this world gets. She is alive, she has her memories back and her true face, and she is reunited with the son who never stopped looking for her, and she still has her husband Ikam and her daughter Kiyi, and Zuko and Azula gain a mother and a little sister in the same moment. It is a rare thing in this story, an actual reunion, an actual homecoming, a wound that really does close. And I think it lands as hard as it does because of how long we waited for it, and how strange the answer turned out to be. The missing mother was not dead, and she was not simply hiding. She had chosen to forget, and then she chose to remember, and the whole thing turns on the terrible, beautiful weight of that decision. Now to the girl who threw knives and loved a difficult prince, and whose future is far less settled than the fandom likes to pretend. Mai is where I have to slow down and be careful, because this is a spot where a lot of viewers carry a memory of the show that the actual canon quietly complicates. At the end of the series, Mai and Zuko are back together. She confronts him, she tells him off for the way he left, and then she kisses him. And the last you see of them in the animated show, they are a couple, the goth girl and the reformed prince. And it is easy and satisfying to assume they simply married and ruled together for the rest of their days. The trouble is, the canon does not actually say that, and in the comics it goes somewhere messier. In the post-war stories, Mai and Zuko break up. The pressures of him being Fire Lord, the secrets he keeps, the sheer difficulty of loving a man carrying an empire pull them apart. For a stretch, Mai is on her own, and she becomes involved for a while with a young man named K-Lo, who is connected to the very Ozai loyalist group that is causing Zuko so much trouble. Part of why she gets close to him is to gather information, playing a dangerous game inside the enemy's circle. But part of it becomes real, or real enough. And through all of that, she and Zuko keep orbiting each other, still tangled up, still unfinished. There's a whole thread where Zuko helps rescue Mai's kidnapped little brother, Tom Tom, and it brings the two of them back into something like closeness. By the end of that arc, she has broken things off with K-Lo, and she and Zuko are back on warmer terms. But, and this is the crucial part, the story stops short of confirming that they permanently reunited or married. So what is Mai's actual fate? Honestly, it is left open. We know she is a fiercely loyal, sharp, guarded woman who spent her youth bored out of her mind and her early adulthood entangled with the most complicated man in the world. We know she and Zuko loved each other and hurt each other and kept coming back. But whether they ended up together for good, whether she is the mother of Zuko's daughter Izumi, whether she is the woman he settled down with, the canon simply does not tell us. It is left deliberately unresolved. I know that's not the neat answer a lot of people want, and I know the romantic in all of us wants to just declare that of course they married and of course she is Izumi's mother. But the honest truth is that the story never says so, and I would rather give you the real uncertainty than a comfortable invention. Mai's ending is a door left ajar. Now to the other girl from that trio, the acrobat who defected and whose afterstory is the gentlest of the three. Ty Lee has the sweetest and simplest afterstory of Azula's old circle, and it is a small, quiet joy to tell after all that darkness. Ty Lee, if you remember, was the cheerful, acrobatic one, the girl who could disable a bender with a few precise jabs to the pressure points, blocking the flow of energy in the body so that a firebender could not so much as light a candle. And I want to be exact about what she does, because people sometimes muddle it. Ty Lee is not a bender. She does not bend anyone's chi in a mystical sense. She physically strikes the points on the body that block a person's inner energy, a martial art, not a bending art, and it makes her almost impossible to fight, precisely because bending does not protect you from her at all. Her turn against Azula happens at the Boiling Rock, the Great Volcano Prison, when she chooses her friend Mai over Azula and takes Azula down to save her. She and Mai are thrown into that prison for the betrayal, and while she is there, something unexpected happens. Ty Lee befriends the Kyoshi warriors, the group of elite female fighters who had been imprisoned too. And that friendship becomes the whole shape of her future. After the war, Ty Lee joins the Kyoshi warriors properly. She becomes one of them, a full and accepted member, bringing her chi blocking into their ranks and finding in that sisterhood exactly the kind of belonging she never had as one of 7 identical sisters, or as a member of Azula's cold little court. The girl who spent her youth being either interchangeable or intimidated finds a family of equals who actually want her. It is not a grand fate, and it is not tragic, and it does not need to be. Ty Lee gets to be happy, gets to be useful, gets to be surrounded by friends who chose her. Sometimes that is the whole story, and it is enough. Now to the leader of those very warriors, and a fate that is far less documented than you might expect. Suki is a frustrating one to research honestly, and I would rather tell you that than pretend I have more than I do. Suki, the leader of the Kyoshi warriors, the capable, grounded woman who becomes Sokka's partner, ends the series firmly at the center of Team Avatar, having fought in the final battle and won the boy. And in the comics, she is right there in the years after the war too. The Kyoshi warriors serve for a while as Fire Lord Zuko's personal bodyguards, protecting the young ruler in his dangerous early reign, and Suki is among them, close to the action, close to Sokka. Later, she steps away from that duty to be with Sokka and the group again. She is present, she is active, she is clearly still deeply tied to Sokka through this whole window, but here is where it gets thin. Suki's long-term fate, the far end of her life, is simply not documented in the animated canon. She does not appear in Korra's era, and the creators, when asked what became of her, mostly deflected with jokes rather than answers. There is a well-known offhand remark from the creators that Sokka and Suki essentially moved to the suburbs together. A cute non-answer that fans have clung to precisely because it is the closest thing to a resolution we ever got. But whether their relationship truly lasted a lifetime, whether they married, whether they had children, none of that is actually confirmed. And this connects to the Sokka mystery we already faced. Because if Sokka died at some unknown point before Korra's time, then Suki's later life, whatever it was lived in his absence, and we simply are not shown it. So the honest fate of Suki is a shrug wrapped in a joke, a beloved character the story loved enough to keep around and then softly forgot to give an ending to. I find that a little sad, frankly, because she deserved a real one. What we can say for certain is that she spent the years right after the war doing exactly what she always did, protecting people who needed it and standing beside the man she loved. Beyond that, the canon goes quiet, and I will not fill that quiet with things I cannot verify. Now to the fallen tyrant himself, the man at the root of all of it, and what the world did with him once he had lost. Ozai is the villain, and the striking thing about his afterstory is how deliberately powerless it is, because that powerlessness was the entire point. Remember how the war actually ends between him and Aang. Ozai, supercharged by the comet at the height of his monstrous power, is beaten, and Aang has him at his mercy, and the whole moral weight of the series comes down on a single decision. Everyone around Aang, and arguably the audience, expected him to kill Ozai, because how else do you end a man like that? And Aang refused. He found another way, using a rare and dangerous ancient technique called energy bending, taught to him by a giant ancient creature called a lion turtle. Aang reached into the very spirit of Ozai and permanently took his firebending away. He did not kill him. He unmade him as a threat. So Ozai lives. That is the fate of the great villain of Avatar. He is not executed, he is not martyred, he is simply switched off and locked up. He spends the rest of his life imprisoned in the capital city prison, a firebender with no fire, a conqueror with nothing left to conquer, an ex-god sitting in a cell. And I think there is something subtly brilliant about that as an ending for him, because for a man whose entire identity was power and dominance and being feared, the cruelest possible fate is not death. Death would have made him a symbol. The cruelest fate is to be alive and utterly irrelevant, to sit powerless while the son he despised rebuilds the world in the opposite of his image. He does not go entirely gently, of course. In the years after the war, he keeps trying to reach out and poison things from inside his cell. He is the one Zuko secretly visits for guidance, and he uses those visits to try to twist his son. He is connected, through Azula, to the schemes of his loyalists who dream of putting him back on the throne. He is a spider in a locked room, still spinning, still whispering, still trying to make himself matter. But it never works. Every attempt to reassert himself fails, and the world keeps moving past him, and Zuko keeps choosing to be nothing like him. Ozai is not shown alive in Korra's era, and by then he would certainly be long dead, having died as he lived his final decades, caged and stripped and beaten, the last flicker of an empire that his own son subtly dismantled around him. The man who wanted to burn the world to rule its ashes ended up as a small old prisoner nobody feared anymore. Now to a much older friend and a much gentler end, the mad genius king of Omashu. King Bumi is one of my favorite small threads to pull on because his fate is tied up in a lovely piece of naming that reaches all the way into the future. Bumi, the king of Omashu, was Aang's childhood friend, a boy Aang knew 100 years before the events of the series, which means that when Aang wakes up from the iceberg and finally reunites with him, Bumi is a wildly eccentric old man well past 100 years of age, and Aang is still 12. That reunion is one of the sweetest jokes in the show, the ancient king and the frozen boy who used to be the same age. Bumi's great moment in the war comes near the very end when the comet arrives and he single-handedly liberates his own city of Omashu, which had been captured by the Fire Nation, waiting patiently in captivity for exactly the right day to strike. He was always the most patient man in the world, willing to wait years for the perfect moment, and he got it. But as for what happens to him after the war, the honest answer is simple and gentle. Bumi was already impossibly old during the series, over 100, and while the canon does not give us a death scene for him, it is understood that he died of old age not long after, well before Korra's time. He had lived far longer than any person has a right to. He saw his city freed. He saw his oldest friend return to the world. And then, in the natural course of things, the old mad genius passed on. There is no tragedy in it. He got everything a man could want out of a life that long. And here is the naming detail that makes me smile every time. Aang loved his old friend so much that he named his own firstborn son after him. Aang's eldest child, the non-bender who would one day astonishingly gain airbending in his old age, is named Bumi in honor of the king of Omashu. So the Mad King's name lives on, carried into the next generation, worn by the son of the Avatar. Which means that when you hear about Aang's boy Bumi in the future, you are hearing an echo of 100-and-something-year-old earthbending king who liberated a city by waiting for a comet. That is the kind of quiet continuity this world does so well. The people leave, but their names keep walking around. Now to the father who led the men of the South to war, and what he built when the fighting was done. Hakoda is Sokka and Katara's father, and his afterstory is one of the more solidly grounded ones, so let me give it to you straight. During the war, Hakoda led the men of the Southern Water Tribe away to fight, leaving his children behind, a decision that shaped Katara and Sokka's whole childhood, the absent father off at the front. He fought in the war, he was captured and imprisoned at the Boiling Rock, he was broken out in one of the show's best sequences, and he fought in the final push against the Fire Nation. And when the war ended, Hakoda did not simply retire. He became a leader of the rebuilding of the South. In the comics that follow the Southern Water Tribe into the post-war years, Hakoda is the chief of the South, guiding his people through a clearly difficult transition. Because the war ending does not mean the hardship ends. The Southern Water Tribe had been reduced to almost nothing, and now it has to grow again, and part of how it grows is by opening up to help and influence from the much larger, much wealthier Northern Water Tribe. That brings modernization, new industry, new money, and a real tension between the people who want the South to develop and the people who feel their traditions are being erased by Northern outsiders. Hakoda stands at the center of that, a leader trying to hold his tribe together through change, working alongside Northern partners to rebuild while a violent faction wants to reject all outside influence by force. He is a steady, decent man doing the unglamorous work of leading a people out of ruin, and his children, Katara and Sokka, come home to help him do it. His exact later years and death are not spelled out in detail, but the picture is clear enough. Hakoda got to see his tribe survive, got his children back, and spent his final chapter as the respected chief of a people clawing their way back to life. Now to the stern old master who softened just enough to elope, and the grandmother who finally got the ending she ran away to find. Pakku and Kana are a pairing I adore because their afterstory is basically a very old love story finally getting its second chance. To understand it, you have to know both halves. Kanna, called Gran Gran, is Katara and Sokka's grandmother, the matriarch of their little corner of the Southern Water Tribe. And decades before the series, as a young woman in the Northern Water Tribe, Kanna had been betrothed, in an arranged match she did not choose, to a young waterbending prodigy. She refused that life, the rigid, unequal traditions of the North, where women were not even allowed to learn to fight, and she made an extraordinary escape, traveling all the way across the world from the North Pole to the South to build a free life on her own terms. The young man she left behind, heartbroken, was Pakku. When Aang and the group reached the Northern Water Tribe in the first season, that same Pakku is now the master waterbender of the North, an old, stern, deeply traditional man, and it is Katara who finally cracks him open by challenging the very sexism that drove her grandmother away all those years before. And in the moment, Pakku realizes that this fierce girl demanding to be taught is the granddaughter of Kanna, the woman he never stopped loving. Something in the old man thaws. So here is where it goes after the war. Pakku travels south. He helps rebuild the shattered waterbending traditions of the Southern Water Tribe, passing on the knowledge that had nearly died out there. And he reunites with Kanna, and this time she says yes. The two of them, both old now, marry decades after they were first meant to, which makes Pakku the step-grandfather of Katara and Sokka. The prodigy she fled from as a girl becomes the grandfather of the very children who helped free the world. Both of them, in the natural way of things, would pass of old age well before Korra's time, but they got their years together, the ending that a rigid tradition denied them the first time around. A love story with a 50-year intermission and a happy final act. Now to the four who kept the old flame alive across every nation, the secret society of masters. The Order of the White Lotus is one of the quieter marvels of this world, and its members deserve a moment because their afterstory is really the afterstory of an idea. The White Lotus is an ancient secret society that stretches across all four nations, made up of masters who value knowledge, philosophy, and beauty above the borders that divide their countries. For most of the war, they operated in the shadows, but in the final days, they revealed themselves in force, an assembled company of the greatest old masters alive, and together they marched on Ba Sing Se and liberated the great city from Fire Nation occupation. That assembly of old lions is one of the most satisfying reveals in the whole series, all these mentors from across the show turning out to be members of the same hidden brotherhood. You already know several of them by their fates. Iroh was the Grand Lotus, the leader, and we have followed him all the way to his tea shop in the spirit world. Pakku was among them, and he went south to marry Kanna. Bumi of Omashu was one too, and he returned to his liberated city to live out his final years. But there were others whose specific later lives the canon leaves gentle and undetailed, and I would rather tell you that honestly than invent endings for them. There is Piandao, the master swordsman who trained Sokka in the blade, a Fire Nation man of extraordinary skill and grace who chose knowledge and honor over his nation's war. There is Zhong, the fire-bending master who deserted the Fire Nation army because he came to hate what fire could do in the wrong hands, a man so afraid of his own power that he taught restraint above all. These masters continued after the war to be what they always were, keepers of knowledge, teachers, guardians of the deeper traditions, and the society itself carried on into the future. And that is the real point of the White Lotus after the war. The order does not fade. It becomes even more important because in the era that follows, it is the White Lotus that takes on the responsibility of finding, protecting, and training the new Avatar. When Korra is identified as a small child, it is White Lotus sentries who guard her and White Lotus masters who oversee her training. So the secret society that Iroh led, the brotherhood of old masters who liberated Ba Sing Se, becomes the institution that raises the next Avatar. The idea outlives every single one of the men who revealed it on that day outside the city walls. Knowledge kept and passed on exactly as they intended. Now to the two who never spoke a word and stayed by Aang's side through all of it, the bison and the lemur. Appa and Momo are the two who get to me because they were with Aang from the very beginning, from before the beginning really. And the question of what happens to an animal companion after the story ends is a surprisingly hard one to answer honestly. Start with Appa, the sky bison. Appa is not just a mount, he is the last of his kind that Aang knew for most of the series. A survivor of the same genocide that wiped out the air nomads because the flying bison were the companions of the Airbenders, and they died alongside them. For most of the show, Appa and one other bison are all Aang believes remains of that whole species. But here is the wonderful thing that the after story confirms. Aang, in his rebuilding years, went looking, and he found a wild herd of sky bison and a colony of winged lemurs, hidden away and surviving, which means the species did not die out. The flying bison live on into the future, and by Korra's era, there are sky bison again in the world, descendants of that rediscovered herd, carried forward alongside the eventual revival of the Airbenders themselves. Appa himself, being a sky bison, was a long-lived creature, and he stayed Aang's loyal companion through the decades of that rebuilding. The canon does not give us a precise death scene for Appa, but the understanding is that he lived a long life at Aang's side and passed, as these companions do, somewhere near the twilight of Aang's own life. What matters is that Appa was not the last. Because of Aang's searching, the bison outlived them both. Momo, the winged lemur, is harder, and I have to be straight with you here. Momo's specific fate after the series is one of the genuine blanks in the canon. He was, like Appa, believed to be one of the last of his kind when Aang found him at the Southern Air Temple. And like the bison, the lemurs turned out to survive in that hidden colony Aang discovered, so the species carries on. But what happened to Momo himself? The individual little creature who rode on Aang's shoulder and stole Sokka's food is simply not documented. The story does not tell us when or how he died, and I am not going to invent a moment for him, because a made-up ending for Momo would be exactly the kind of false comfort I would rather not hand you. Lemurs do not live as long as sky bison or people, so in the plain arithmetic of it, Momo would have reached the end of his little life somewhere in Aang's adult years. But the canon draws a gentle blank over the details. Sometimes the kindest and most honest thing is to say that we simply were not shown, and to let the last clear image of him be what it is, a small, bright creature perched on the shoulder of a boy who loved him, flying over a world that was finally at peace. Now to a running joke that turns out to have the longest legacy of anyone, the man and his cabbages. The Cabbage Merchant is the best long game in the entire franchise, and I love it far more than a throwaway gag has any right to be loved. Through the series, he is a pure background joke, a hapless traveling vegetable seller whose cart of cabbages gets destroyed, over and over, in every possible way, in city after city, always followed by his anguished cry over his ruined produce. He is a punchline with a cart. He has no arc, no lines that matter, nothing but the running misfortune of a man who cannot keep his cabbages intact within 100 feet of the Avatar. And then, 2 generations later, the franchise pays it off about as perfectly as a running joke ever could. In Korra's era, one of the largest, wealthiest corporations in Republic City is a manufacturing and technology giant called Cabbage Corp. And Cabbage Corp was founded by the descendant of the Cabbage Merchant. The man whose cart got smashed in every episode has a bloodline that goes on to build an industrial empire, a mega corporation, a household name in the great modern city. The universe took the sorriest background nobody in the whole show and made his family into titans. I simply could not tell you a better example of this world rewarding patience, even patience the character never knew he was showing. The cabbages were destroyed 100 times, and then his grandchildren owned the future. That is the kind of deep, silly, loving continuity that makes people fall for this franchise. Somewhere out there, the ghost of a ruined cart is very, very proud. Now, to the ones who did not make it out of the war, the friends and enemies who were already gone before any of these after stories began. Before we go further into the future, I want to pause on the people whose stories had already ended by the time the finale arrived, because part of understanding what happened after is understanding who was not there to see it. This is the quieter, sadder inventory, the ones who were already gone. There is Jet, the charismatic, dangerous young freedom fighter who led a band of war orphans against the Fire Nation and whose zealotry curdled into something frightening. Jet died in Ba Sing Se, cut down under the city by the Dai Li after being brainwashed and then breaking free of it. And the show handled his death with a famously bleak little exchange. One character asking if he was going to be okay, and another simply, almost silently, not answering in a way that answers everything. Jet never saw the war end. He was gone in the second season, a boy whose anger the world used up and threw away. There is Yue, the princess of the Northern Water Tribe, gentle and luminous, who gave up her own life to restore the moon spirit after it was killed, becoming the moon itself. Yue does not have an afterstory in the ordinary sense because Yue became something larger than a person. She is up there still, the moon in the sky over every scene that follows, the tide she governs pulling at every ocean in every episode to come. In a strange way, she never truly leaves at all because she is literally hanging over the whole world for the rest of time, watching. A girl who traded her human future to become a permanent part of the sky. There is Admiral Zhao, the arrogant commander who murdered the moon spirit and was dragged down into the ocean by the enraged ocean spirit in the same terrible night, gone beneath the water. There is Combustion Man, the terrifying silent assassin killed by his own explosive power in the third season. There is Long Feng, the schemer who ran Ba Sing Se from the shadows, who ends the series defeated and imprisoned, his grip on power broken. And there are the deeper losses that predate the whole series, the ones whose absence is the reason the story exists at all. Monk Gyatso, Aang's beloved guardian and father figure, killed in the genocide that took the air nomads, whose remains Aang finds in the first season in one of the bleakest moments the series ever shows. And the past avatars, Roku and Kyoshi and Kuruk and Yangchen and all the others, long dead by definition, present only as spirits and memories and voices of counsel. I bring all of them up not to be grim, but because the afterstory of any world is shaped as much by its holes as by its survivors. When Aang built the new world, he built it in the memory of Gyatso. When the tides moved, they moved because of Yue. The war did not just end. It ended for the people who lived to see it, and it did not end at all for the ones it had already taken. Hold them gently as we go forward, because the future the survivors built was a future these ones never got to walk in. Now to the reluctant monarch behind a very tall wall, and the enormous thing his cooperation made possible. The Earth King, Kui, is a character it is easy to underestimate, because for most of his time on screen, he is almost comically sheltered. A young monarch kept so completely in the dark by his own advisors that he does not even know his nation is at war, ruling from behind the great walls of Ba Sing Se while men like Long Feng pull every string. When the truth finally reaches him and his city falls, Kui is forced out into a world he barely knew existed, and he goes off, humbled, to travel his own kingdom and actually see it for the first time, accompanied only by his pet bear. But Kui's real importance comes after the war, and it is remarkably large, even though he is not the one who gets remembered for it. When the fighting ends and the great colonial knot has to be untangled, when the question of what to do with those 100 years of blended Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom towns comes to a head, it is Kui, as the Earth King, whose agreement is essential. The land those colonies sit on is Earth Kingdom land. Nothing can be done with it without the Earth King's cooperation. And Kui, together with Aang and Zuko, makes the decision that reshapes the whole map. Rather than forcibly tear those mixed communities apart, the three leaders agree to give that contested territory over to something new, an independent nation belonging to no single people, where anyone of any nation can live. The Earth King signs away a piece of his own kingdom to make room for the future. It is a deeply selfless act of statesmanship from a man everyone had written off as a sheltered fool, and it is the direct origin of everything the next era is built on. So Kui's afterstory is not glamorous, and the canon does not follow his personal life in much detail, but his signature is on the founding of the modern world. The sheltered king behind the wall grew up enough to help give away part of his own throne so that something better could stand where the colonies used to be. Now to that new thing itself, arguably the single biggest thing that happened after the series ended, the birth of a whole nation. If you want to point at one single consequence of Avatar, the last Airbender that dwarfs all the others, it is this. The war ended, and out of its ashes, the heroes built a fifth nation that had never existed before, the United Republic of Nations, with a capital called Republic City. And that place becomes the entire stage on which Korra's story is told. Everything you might know about the sequel era, the cars and the radios and the skyscrapers and the pro-bending arenas and the multicultural streets, all of it exists because of the people we have been following tonight. The world of the future is quite literally their monument. Let me trace how it came to be, because it is a truly beautiful piece of world building. The problem, as we have already touched on, was the colonies. 100 years of Fire Nation expansion had left deep colonial towns inside Earth Kingdom territory. And after the war, there was a movement supported at first even by Aang and Zuko to undo the occupation entirely by removing every Fire Nation colonist and returning the land to the Earth Kingdom, wiping the map clean of the war. It sounded just. It was called, in the language of the time, the effort to restore harmony. But when Zuko actually went and looked at one of the largest and oldest of those colonies, he found something that could not be simply undone. He found a place where Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom people had lived together for generations, intermarried, raised children who were both and neither, built a shared culture that belonged to no single nation. To tear that apart would be its own kind of violence, and so Zuko changed his position, and it fractured his friendship with Aang, and the two of them ended up on opposite sides of a genuine, unsolvable moral crisis, the closest these two ever came to becoming enemies. The resolution, when it finally came, was to stop trying to force the past back into its old shape, and instead build something new. Aang, Zuko, and Earth King Kui agreed that the contested colonial lands would not go back to the Earth Kingdom and would not stay with the Fire Nation. They would become an independent, self-governing nation of their own, a place defined not by a single element or a single people, but by the mixing of all of them. That growing colonial town at the center of it all became the seed of a great metropolis, and that metropolis became Republic City, the capital of the United Republic of Nations. It was the first place in the world designed from the start to belong to everyone. Benders and non-benders, all four nations under one flag. And the people we love built it and ran it. Aang poured his post-war life into it as the Avatar overseeing the balance of this new experiment. Sokka, as we have said, sat on its very first governing council, one of the founding lawmakers of the new nation, helping to write the rules a country of mixed peoples would live by. Toph brought her metal-bending police force to keep order in its streets. Zuko helped guard it in his later years. This city is the joint project of the entire generation, the thing they made together once the fighting was done, the physical proof that they did not just win a war, they built a peace. And peace is a much harder thing to construct than victory. Here's what moves me about Republic City as the great afterstory. A war is destruction. Anyone can be remembered for a battle. What this generation chose to be remembered for instead was a city, a living, crowded, imperfect, thriving city full of people who would never know their names. By Korra's era, Republic City is a sprawling modern place with all the problems of any real city: crime, inequality, corrupt politicians, tension between benders and non-benders, and I actually think that messiness is the highest possible compliment to its founders. They did not build a utopia, they built a real place, and real places have troubles. And the fact that the biggest problems of the next era are ordinary civic problems rather than a 100-year genocidal war is itself the measure of how much these people accomplished. They lowered the stakes of the world. They made it so that the great crisis of the next generation could be about policing and politics and civil rights rather than survival. That is what winning actually looks like. In the long run, not a perfect world, a normal one. And it is worth naming what Republic City is not, because it matters. It is not part of the Earth Kingdom, and it is not a Fire Nation colony, and it is not a Water Tribe outpost. It is a fifth thing, a nation with no bending element of its own, a really multicultural society where a person's nation of origin matters less than the fact that they all share the same streets. That was a radical idea in a world that had spent its entire history divided into four rigid peoples. And it came from a group of teenagers who had every reason to hate each other's nations and chose instead to build a place where the nations could dissolve into something shared. The whole moral argument of the original series, that the divisions between the four nations are not as deep as the thing they have in common, gets poured into concrete and steel and becomes a city. Now to the deepest wound the war left, and the astonishing, generations-late way it finally began to heal. The return of the Airbenders. The genocide of the air nomads is the original sin the whole series is built on. Before the story even begins, 100 years before, the Fire Nation wiped out an entire people, every airbending temple, every monk, every child, in a coordinated slaughter timed to a comet, all to prevent the next Avatar, who would be born an Airbender, from ever rising to stop them. Aang survived only because he was frozen in the ice and missed the whole thing. So for the entire series, and for his entire life, Aang carries the unbearable weight of being the last Airbender, the last living member of a murdered culture, the sole survivor of his entire people. And I want to be very precise about what he could and could not fix, because this is a place where it is easy to overstate things. Aang could not bring the Airbenders back in his own lifetime. This is important. He rebuilt the culture, the knowledge, the temples, the traditions. He rediscovered the sky bison and the lemurs so the animals of his people survived. And he had a son, Tenzin, who was born an Airbender, the first new Airbender by blood in a century. But one airbending son is not a nation. Through Aang's entire life and long after his death, Airbenders remained on the very edge of extinction, a tiny handful of people, essentially just Tenzin, and eventually Tenzin's own children. The culture survived as an idea kept alive by a single small family. The murdered people did not come back just because Aang wished it. A genocide is not undone by good intentions, and the show is honest enough never to pretend otherwise. The real return, the astonishing one, happens generations later, long after Aang is in his grave, and it happens through an event the original series never even hinted at. In Korra's era, there is a rare cosmic occurrence called harmonic convergence, a moment when the spirit world and the physical world align in a way that only happens once every 10,000 years, and the spiritual energy of the whole planet surges. And in the wake of that surge, something miraculous and completely unexpected occurs. All across the world, ordinary people, people with no airbending heritage at all, people who had lived their whole lives as non-benders, suddenly and spontaneously gain the ability to airbend. The gift blooms in strangers, in shopkeepers and criminals and farmers scattered across every nation. The airbenders come back, not as descendants of the old ones, but as an entirely new population, called forth by the world itself, as if the planet had been holding its breath for over 2 centuries and finally exhaled. And here's the detail that ties it directly back to the family we have been following, and it is a wonderful one. One of the people who spontaneously gains airbending in that moment is Bumi, Aang's own eldest son, the non-bender. Remember, Aang had 3 children, and only the youngest, Tenzin, was an airbender, while Bumi and Kaya were born without air. Bumi spent his whole life as the non-bending son of the Avatar, a military man who could not do the one thing his father's people were known for. And then, in his old age, during harmonic convergence, Bumi suddenly becomes an airbender. The son who was passed over gets the gift at last, decades late, completely out of nowhere. I find that truly joyful. The universe circled all the way back around and handed Aang's overlooked boy the very thing that would have connected him to his father all along. So the true healing of the air nomad genocide is not something any single hero accomplishes. It takes a family keeping the flame alive across generations, and then a once-in-10,000 years cosmic event, and then the patient rebuilding of a whole new air nation out of strangers who woke up one morning able to fly. Aang laid every piece of the groundwork, the culture, the bison, the temples, the teachings, and he did not live to see the harvest. Tenzin, his son, becomes the one who takes those brand new airbenders and trains them, and gives them the traditions his father preserved, turning a scattered accident of gifted strangers into a real living nation again. The last airbender's dream comes true 2 generations after he died, built on the foundation he spent his short life laying. If you ever needed proof that the after-story of this world is as rich as the story itself, it is this. The single greatest thing Aang wanted, the return of his people, happens entirely in the years after the series ended, and he was not there to see it. Now to the son who carried all of that on his shoulders, and to his siblings, the 3 children of the Avatar. Tenzin is, in a sense, the true heir of Aang, and his after-story, which is really the next generation's whole story, deserves proper time. He is the youngest of Aang and Katara's 3 children, and he is the only one of the 3 born an airbender, which meant that from birth he carried a burden none of his siblings had to carry. He was, for most of his life, the last airbending master alive besides his father. And after Aang died, Tenzin became the sole living master of a nearly extinct art and the only person capable of passing on the full airbending tradition. Imagine growing up as the child in whom your father's murdered culture rests. Everything Aang preserved, Tenzin had to carry, and he felt every ounce of that weight. By the time Korra's story begins, Tenzin is around 50 years old, a serious, principled, sometimes rigid man, a member of the council that governs Republic City, and the keeper of air nomad culture. He lives on a small island near the city, a preserved pocket of the old airbending life. He is married to a woman named Pima, and together they have 4 children, and those 4 children were, before harmonic convergence brought new airbenders into the world, quite possibly the entire future of the airbending bloodline. Their names are Jinora, Ikki, Milo, and the youngest, Rohan. The 3 eldest are all airbenders, which meant that for a while Tenzin's household was, astonishingly, most of the airbenders left in existence. A single family on a single island holding the whole legacy of the air nomads. The eldest of those children, Jinora, is worth pausing on, because she becomes remarkable in her own right. Jinora grows into an exceptionally gifted and deeply spiritual airbender, so talented that she becomes a full airbending master while still very young, earning the traditional airbending master tattoos, the same arrow markings her grandfather Aang wore, at an age that stuns everyone around her. She turns out to have a profound connection to the spirit world, a gift for crossing between worlds that echoes her grandfather's spiritual depth. So Aang's spiritual gift, the very thing that made him the Avatar, skips down through the family and blooms again in his granddaughter, a girl he never lived to meet. There is a real beauty in that, the arrow on the forehead reappearing 2 generations later on a child who carries the same light he did. Now to Tenzin's siblings because they get lives too, and good ones. Kaya, the middle child, is a waterbender through and through, having taken after her mother rather than her father. She grows up to be a free spirit, a traveler, and a healer, following in her mother's waterbending footsteps rather than her father's airbending path. In the next era, she is a wandering, warm, independent woman who eventually comes home to help care for her aging mother and to stand with her brothers when the world needs the children of Aang. And Bumi, the eldest, the non-bender turned late-life airbender we just spoke about, spent his life before that transformation as a commander in the United Forces, the military of the New Republic. A boisterous, larger-than-life man who proved you did not need bending to be a force in the world, exactly as his uncle Sokka had proven a generation before. When Bumi gains airbending in his old age, he throws himself into learning it with the same wild energy he brought to everything. An old soldier suddenly a beginner again, and there is something delightful about that. What strikes me about those 3 taken together is how neatly they divide their parents between them. Bumi got his uncle Sokka's swagger and eventually his father's air. Kaya got her mother's water and her mother's name. And Tenzin got his father's element, his father's burden, and his father's role as the keeper of a fragile, precious tradition. The 3 of them are the pieces of Aang and Katara scattered forward into the future. And in the next Avatar's darkest hours, it is these 3 siblings, the children of the Last Airbender, who stand together and fight to protect the world their parents built. The Avatar died young, but he lived on in them, split 3 ways, carried forward into a century he never saw. Now to the 2 sisters who inherited a different legend, the daughters of Toph. The Beifong sisters, Lin and Suyin, are the next generation's other great inheritance, and their story is the story of what Toph's fire looked like once it split into 2 very different daughters who could barely stand each other. We touched on them when we followed Toph, but they earn their own moment because in the next era they are major figures in their own right. Lin is the elder, a stern, iron-willed woman who followed her mother directly into law enforcement and became chief of police of Republic City, wearing the metal-bending armor, commanding the very force her mother founded. If Toph invented the police force in a cage, Lin is the one who inherited it and ran it with a rigid, unbending sense of duty. She is prickly, guarded, deeply lonely for much of her story, a woman who devoted everything to the job because the personal side of her life carried old wounds. And a lot of those wounds trace back to her sister. Suyin, the younger, took the family gift in the opposite direction entirely. Where Lin chose order and law, Su chose creation and freedom. As a young woman, she was wild and reckless, and there was a genuine rupture between the sisters, a violent incident in their youth that left Lin physically scarred and the two of them estranged for decades. Su went on to found her own city, Zaofu, a gleaming, domed metropolis made entirely of metal, the most beautiful expression of metalbending anywhere in the world, a self-made utopia she built from nothing as the matriarch of a large, thriving family. So Toph's two daughters end up embodying the two halves of their mother. Lin is Toph's discipline, her toughness, her sense of justice, the cop. Su is Toph's inventiveness, her rebelliousness, her refusal to accept the world as given, the artist and builder. And the tragedy and eventual grace of their story is that these two halves of the same woman spent most of their lives unable to speak to each other, carrying a decades-old grudge, until the world finally forced them back together, and they had to find a way, late in life, to be sisters again. Their reconciliation is one of the quiet, emotional payoffs of the next era. And it is really the completion of Toph's own story, the old woman in the swamp finally getting to see her fractured daughters mend. The blind girl who bent iron in a cage lived long enough to become a grandmother many times over through Su's big family, and her legacy runs the police and builds the cities of the modern world. Not bad for a runaway. Before we get to her, though, there are a few threads still worth following because the afterstory is not only about people, it is about a throne and a set of arts and a whole world that grew up while the heroes aged. Let's take the throne first, and Zuko's own heir. Fire Lord Izumi is a character most casual fans do not even know exists, and she deserves better because she is the living proof that Zuko succeeded. Izumi is Zuko's only child, his daughter, which also makes her the granddaughter of Ozai, and think for a moment about what that lineage means. She is the direct descendant of the man who tried to burn the world, and she grew up to rule the Fire Nation in an age of peace. Whatever poison ran in that royal bloodline, whatever cruelty Ozai embodied and Azula inherited, by the time it reached Izumi, it had been filtered through Zuko's long, patient, deliberate effort to be a better man than his father, and it came out clean. Izumi ascends to the throne when Zuko abdicates, about 67 years after the war ended, and she rules the Fire Nation into Korra's era. And what we see of her reign tells you exactly what kind of ruler Zuko raised. In the great crisis of the next generation, when a militaristic threat rises and the world's leaders gather to decide how to respond, Izumi is there at the summit of world leaders, calm and measured, and her instinct is restraint. She is deeply reluctant to commit the Fire Nation's military to conflict, wary of her nation ever again being the aggressor that plunges the world into war. You can hear Zuko in that caution, and you can hear the whole moral lesson of the original series in it too. The Fire Nation under Ozai was the nation that could not stop making war. Under Izumi, 3 generations later, it has become the nation that has to be talked into fighting even when fighting may be justified. That is a complete transformation of a national character, and it happened across just 3 rulers, Ozai to Zuko to Izumi, tyrant to reformer to peacemaker. We do not get an enormous amount of Izumi's personal life, and I will not invent what is not there. Her own mother, as we discussed, is never confirmed in the canon, which is one of those frustrating gaps. But her place in the story is clear, and it is important. She is the safe pair of hands the whole 100-year war was ultimately fought to make possible. And she has children of her own who carry the line further, including a son who becomes a general in the United Forces, a young man named Iroh, after Zuko's beloved uncle, closing yet another loop in this family that cannot stop naming its children after the people it loved. So the Fire Nation royal line, which began this whole story as the villain's dynasty, ends the franchise as a stable, cautious, honorable monarchy, led by a thoughtful woman who would sooner talk than burn. Ozai's throne in the end belongs to his granddaughter, and she is nothing like him. And that is the quiet victory of the entire saga. Now to something bigger than any single person, the way the world itself changed shape. One of the strange and wonderful things about following these characters into the future is watching the world around them transform almost beyond recognition, because the era that follows does not look like the era of the war at all. The world of Avatar. The Last Airbender is, broadly, a place of sailing ships and ostrich horses, of walled cities and lantern light, a setting that feels roughly medieval with pockets of Fire Nation industrial might. And within a single long lifetime, within the span of the years these characters live through, that world industrializes with astonishing speed. By the time Katara and Toph and Zuko are elderly, the world has automobiles and telephones and radio broadcasts and electric lights and towering buildings of steel and glass. It is as if the setting fast-forwarded from something like the Middle Ages to something like the roaring 1920s, all inside the lifetime of the people who fought the war. And this matters for our characters in a way that is easy to overlook but honestly poignant. It means that these people, the heroes of the war, lived to become the old-fashioned ones. Katara, who grew up in an igloo at the bottom of the world, lived to see cars driving through a metal city. Toph, who was born to a sheltered noble family in a walled estate, lived to found a police force that chased criminals through an industrial metropolis. Zuko, who came of age on a coal-powered warship, lived long enough to fly over skyscrapers on a dragon. They became, all of them, living relics of an older world, the last people who remembered when things were slower and smaller and more divided. There is a particular kind of melancholy in that, the melancholy of any long life, the experience of outliving the world you were born into, and finding yourself a stranger in the one your own victory made possible. I think this is actually one of the cleverest things the franchise ever did, and it is very rarely talked about as part of the afterstory, but it absolutely is one. The heroes did not just win a war and freeze in Amber. They aged into a future that moved on without them, a future they helped cause and then could barely keep up with. The peace they built created the stability that allowed technology and commerce to explode, and that explosion remade the world into something their younger selves would hardly have recognized. Aang, mercifully or tragically depending on how you look at it, died before most of it arrived. But Katara and Toph and Zuko lived to walk, slowly now, through a modern world, the last living bridges back to a time of comets and warships, and a 100-year war that the young people around them knew only as history. The war they ended became a story in a book, and they became the old people who had actually been there. Now to the arts themselves, the bending, and how it changed once the fighting stopped. The bending arts do not stand still after the war either, and tracing what happened to them is its own kind of afterstory, because bending is the beating heart of this world and the war changed how people thought about it. Start with the one we have already followed, metalbending. When Toph invented it, she was the only metalbender in the world, a single blind girl who had done the impossible. By the time she was old, metalbending was a common, teachable discipline practiced by an entire police force and used to build whole cities. In the span of one lifetime, an art went from non-existent to foundational. That is a staggering rate of change for a skill that people had believed for all of history was simply impossible. Toph did not just learn a trick, she permanently expanded what benders could do, and the world reorganized itself around her invention. Then there is the darker art, bloodbending, and its fate is one of the more sobering threads. Bloodbending is the horrifying ability of a waterbender to seize control of the water inside another person's body and puppet them like a marionette, a technique so monstrous it can only be performed in its original form under the full moon. Katara herself learned it, was forced to use it, and hated it. And in the era after the war, as it became clear how much suffering this art could cause, bloodbending was outlawed. In the new United Republic, it became a serious crime, formally banned, and Katara's own experience with its horror was part of what drove that prohibition. So one of the arts of this world was so terrible that the society the heroes built chose to make it illegal, which is a remarkable thing when you consider that the world had spent 100 years using bending of every kind as a weapon of war. The piece was mature enough, eventually, to say that some powers are too dangerous to permit, even when they work. Of course, outlawing a thing does not erase it, and bloodbending resurfaces in the next era in the hands of people willing to break that law. But the taboo itself, the collective decision that this art crosses a line, is a genuine piece of moral progress in the world after the war. Chai blocking, Tai Lee's art, carries forward too, and it takes on a strange political weight. Remember that chui blocking is not bending at all. It is a physical martial art that lets a non-bender neutralize a bender by striking the right points on the body. In the war, it was mostly a curiosity. Tai Lee's party trick turned deadly. But in the next era, as tension grows between benders and non-benders in the crowded, unequal city, chi blocking becomes the signature weapon of a whole movement of non-benders who feel oppressed by bending and want to strip benders of their power. The humble art that Tai Li used to embarrass firebenders becomes, generations later, the tool of a genuine social revolution. That tension between benders and non-benders is actually seeded in the very last of the post-war comics, where a conflict breaks out in the growing colonial town between those who can bend and those who cannot, a factory owner pushing the idea that benders are superior, and it directly foreshadows the great civil conflict of the next era. The war between nations gave way, in time, to a war between the powered and the powerless, and the tools of that new conflict were forged in the old one. And energy bending, the rarest art of all, the one Aang used to strip Ozai of his fire, stays exactly as rare as it should. This is important because it would be easy to imagine energy bending spreading the way metal bending did, but it does not. Energy bending is not a normal bending art that anyone can be taught. Aang learned it from an ancient lion turtle, one of the primordial creatures that hold the oldest knowledge in the world, and it is extraordinarily dangerous, capable of destroying the bender who attempts it if their own spirit is not unbendable. It does not become common, it remains a nearly mythical ability, used only in the direst circumstances, a last resort at the very edge of what the Avatar can do. So the world after the war is one where bending both expanded and was restrained, where a blind girl's invention became commonplace while a monstrous art was outlawed, and a miraculous one stayed locked away. The powers grew, and the world slowly, imperfectly learned to put fences around the deadliest of them. Now to the deepest current running under all of it, the line of avatars themselves and the spirits. Underneath every human story we have followed tonight runs a deeper one, the story of the Avatar line itself and the spirit world it touches. And this is where the after story reaches back thousands of years and forward past everyone we have met. The Avatar is a single soul reincarnated over and over, one being reborn into each nation in turn, following a fixed cycle, and Aang was one bead on a string that stretches back to the very first Avatar at the dawn of human history. When Aang died, that soul passed on into Korra, and the string continued, as it always had. But the past Avatars are not simply gone when they die. They persist, in a sense, as an inner council, a chain of past lives that a living Avatar can reach into for wisdom and power. Aang could commune with Roku, the Fire Nation Avatar who came just before him, and Roku could reach back to Kyoshi, the towering Earth Kingdom Avatar before him, and so on down the line, Kuruk and Yangchen, and back into legend. So even in death, these ancient figures remained present, a reservoir of guidance available to whoever currently carried the soul. When Aang died and Korra was born, Aang joined that council of past lives, taking his place among Roku and Kyoshi and the rest, ready to guide the new Avatar the way his predecessors had guided him. For a while, that is exactly what he did. In Korra's early struggles, Aang appears to her gentle and patient, the previous life reaching forward to steady the current one. The father who died before she was born could still, across the boundary of death and reincarnation, be a kind of presence in her life. The spirit world itself, the place these souls inhabit, also goes through an enormous change in the era after the war, and it is a change that reverses one of Aang's own choices. During the original series, at the end of the very first season, the spirit and physical worlds were largely separated, and the boundary between them stayed closed for most of the century that followed. But in the next Avatar's time, that boundary is deliberately reopened, and the spirits, who had withdrawn from the human world for thousands of years, come flooding back into it. Spirits become visible again, living alongside people, tangling with the modern industrial world in ways nobody had seen for millennia. It is a vast, disorienting change to the fundamental nature of the world, and it happens long after Aang is gone, a reversal of the ancient separation that reshapes the spiritual landscape he knew. The world our heroes lived in and the world their grandchildren lived in were different. Not just in their technology, but in their very metaphysics, the spirits came home. Before we reach the new Avatar herself, two more threads pull the old cast into the new world one final time. And they are worth following because they are the moments when the heroes of the war stepped back onto the stage in their old age. The first is a dark one, a group that came for the new Avatar when she was still a baby. There is a splinter of the White Lotus worth telling you about because it draws several of our characters into the future in a way that matters. The Order of the White Lotus, that noble society of masters, had been entrusted with protecting the new Avatar, but not everyone within that world of secret orders shared its gentle philosophy. A faction broke away, a group of dangerous, brilliant radicals who came to be called the Red Lotus, and their aim was nothing less than tearing down the world order the heroes had built, the nations, the governments, the very idea of centralized power. And their boldest plan was to capture the Avatar while she was still a small child, before she could be trained to defend the system they hated, and to raise or use her for their own ends. This is where the old guard steps forward one last time. When the Red Lotus came for the infant Korra at the Southern Water Tribe, it was the aging heroes of the war who stood in their way. This is the moment we touched on earlier, the last confirmed sighting of Sokka in his 70s, helping to defend the baby. He was there, an old man protecting the reincarnation of his best friend, and it was one of his final acts. And Zuko, too, in his old age, becomes bound up in the fight against the Red Lotus, hunting their members, helping to contain the threat they posed, riding his dragon across the world to keep these radicals from destroying the peace he had spent his life building. So in the twilight of their lives, the boy who never bent and the boy with the scar found themselves once again standing between innocent people and those who would do them harm. Decades after the war, they thought they had finished. The threats never fully stop. The heroes just get older and keep answering the call anyway until they cannot anymore. I find something deeply true in that. The people who save the world do not get to retire from saving it. Sokka defended a baby in his 70s. Zuko chased radicals in his 90s. The war ended, but being the kind of person who stands up when others cannot, that never ended for any of them. And it cost them, and they paid it. The Red Lotus is a next-era threat, but the reason I raise it here is that it is the last time we see the old generation and the new one overlap. The fading heroes of the war handing the fight, quite literally, over the cradle, to the child who would carry it next. Now to the institutions they left behind, the orders and companies of warriors that outlived the people who made them. Something worth pausing on as we near the end is how many of these characters live on, not as individuals, but as institutions, as groups and orders that outlasted every one of their founders. We have already watched a few of these take root. The Metalbending police force, born from Toph's invention, still patrols the great city long after Toph has retired to her swamp. The United Republic Council, which Sokka helped found, still governs long after Sokka is gone. The Order of the White Lotus carries on its ancient work of guarding knowledge and the Avatar. And there is one more of these that deserves a word, the Kyoshi Warriors. The Kyoshi Warriors are an elite order of female fighters, founded centuries before the series by the great Avatar Kyoshi herself, wearing the ceremonial makeup and armor of their namesake, wielding fans and precision rather than bending. Suki led them during the war, Ty Lee joined them after it, and the point is that this order too continues. It served as Fire Lord Zuko's personal guard in the dangerous early years of his reign. It endures as a respected fighting force into the future, a tradition passed from woman to woman down the generations, each new Kyoshi warrior inheriting the discipline and the face paint and the legacy of an Avatar who lived and died centuries before any of them were born. So when we ask what happened to Suki and Ty Lee, part of the answer is that the thing they belonged to outlived them, that the order they served kept marching forward, wearing the same colors long after the individual women were gone. This is one of the quieter lessons of the whole after story, and I keep coming back to it. The people die, and they die on all kinds of schedules, some young like Aang, some in mystery like Sokka, some ancient like Toph. But the things they built, the police forces and councils and orders and cities and schools, those keep going. A person is mortal. An institution can be nearly immortal if it is built well. And this generation, more than any before it in the history of these four nations, was a generation of builders. They did not just fight, they founded. And what they founded is still standing, still working, still shaping lives, generations after the last of them closed their eyes. That is a form of immortality too, maybe the truest one available in a world without magic to cheat death. Now, at last, to the child born the year Aang died, and to the single event that severed the last thread connecting the new world to the old one. Korra is Aang, in the only sense the world of Avatar recognizes. She is the same soul, reincarnated into a new body, a girl born in the Southern Water Tribe. In the very year Aang's life ended, a waterbender rather than an airbender, fierce and physical and headstrong, where Aang was gentle and evasive. But underneath the differences of personality, the same eternal being that has been reborn again and again since the dawn of the world. When you ask what happened to Aang after the series ended, the deepest and strangest answer is that he became her. That his story did not stop, but continued into a new life he would not consciously remember living. That is what it means to be the Avatar. You do not really die. You change bodies and forget. For a while, the connection between the two lives held, and this is the tender part. Even though Korra had no memory of being Aang, she could reach him. As the current Avatar, she had access to that inner council of past lives, and Aang was there among them now, taking his turn as the wise predecessor the way Roku had once guided him. In her early struggles, Korra could call on Aang, could see him, could receive his counsel, the previous incarnation reaching across death and rebirth to steady the frightened young woman who was, in the truest sense, himself. It is a beautiful arrangement when you think about it. Death is not a full ending for the Avatar because the one who dies remains reachable, folded into the mind of the one who follows, a continuous line of counsel stretching back thousands of years. Aang got to keep helping. He got to keep being present in the world faintly from the far side, exactly as his own predecessors had. And then it was taken away, completely and permanently, and this is the single hardest fact in the entire after story. The one I've been holding back until everything else was in place. In the next Avatar's second great trial, a dark and terrible confrontation with a force that sought to end the Avatar line forever, Korra's connection to all of her past lives was severed. The bond that linked her to Aang and through him to Roku and Kyoshi and every Avatar who had ever lived was torn out and destroyed. And even after Korra herself was saved and restored, that connection did not come back. It was gone for good. The link to the past lives was cut, not damaged, not weakened, but ended. Sit with what that actually means because it is enormous and the show lets it land almost without ceremony. It means that Aang, as a guiding presence, is gone. Not gone the way he was gone when he died at 66 because that death still left his soul reachable through the cycle. This is a deeper erasure. After that severing, Korra can no longer call on Aang. She can no longer see him, no longer hear his counsel, no longer reach the accumulated wisdom of every Avatar who came before her. The connection that made death survivable for the Avatar was broken, and in that moment the last thread tying the new world back to Aang and to Roku and to Kyoshi and to the entire 10,000-year chain of past lives went dark. It is, in effect, the beginning of a brand new Avatar cycle, with Korra as its first link and everyone who came before locked away on the other side of a door that will not open again. So the very last thing that happens to Aang in the longest possible view of his story is that he goes fully silent. The boy who was the last airbender, who spent 100 years frozen and then a short life saving the world, and then a long death, gently guiding his own successor, finally, generations after his body died, loses even that lingering voice. The light does not flicker out all at once. It fades in stages. First the body dies, young at 66. Then for a while the spirit remains, reachable, a guide to the next life. And then at last that too is severed and Aang is gone from the world in every way a person can be gone. Present now only in memory, in statues, in stories, in the culture he rebuilt, and the city he founded, and the descendants who carry his blood. The most powerful being in the world, and even he could not stay forever. Nobody does. That, in the end, is what the whole after story is about. But before I draw it all together, there are a few larger shapes worth tracing across everything we have laid out, and the first is the friendship that gently held the whole new world upright. If Aang and Katara are the love story at the center of this saga, then Aang and Zuko are the other great relationship, the one that actually ran the world after the war, and I do not think it gets nearly enough credit for how remarkable it is. Think about where these two started. Zuko spent an entire season hunting Aang across the world, obsessed with capturing him, willing to do almost anything to drag him home in chains and win back his father's love. They were enemy and prey, hunter and hunted, and the idea that they would become the closest of allies, the two young rulers who would jointly reshape the entire planet, would have seemed absurd in those early days. And yet that is exactly what they became. The Avatar and the Fire Lord, the Airbender and the Firebender, the two teenagers who ended up holding the two most powerful positions in the world at the same moment in history. And their partnership was not smooth, which is exactly why I love it. We have already followed the great crisis of the colonies, the one where Zuko changed his mind, and the two of them ended up on opposite sides, so close to becoming enemies again that Zuko made Aang promise to end him if he ever turned tyrant. That is not a comfortable friendship. That is two people who loved each other and disagreed about something enormous and had to find a way through it without breaking the world. And they did find a way through it, and out of their disagreement came the founding of an entire nation. The friendship survived the hardest possible test, a genuine moral rupture between two people with the power to go to war over it, and instead of war, they built a city. That is what mature friendship actually looks like, and it is rare to see it dramatized with this much honesty in any story, let alone one that started as a children's cartoon about a boy in an iceberg. The part that lands hardest for me is this. Aang died first at 66. And Zuko lived on for decades after him into his 90s, which means Zuko spent the last long stretch of his life having outlived his best friend, carrying the memory of the boy who once hunted him, and then forgave him and then trusted him with the world. When Zuko rode his dragon across the world in his old age, still defending the peace, he was defending something he and Aang had built together, alone now, the last keeper of a partnership that had shaped everything. He even lived to know Aang's reincarnation, to meet Korra, to help guide the new Avatar who was, in the deepest sense, his oldest friend returned in a new form. Imagine that. Zuko got to help the reincarnation of the boy he had once tried to capture, an old man mentoring the new life of his dead best friend. The hunter became the guardian of the hunted's very soul, twice over, across 2 lifetimes. If you want one relationship that captures the entire moral journey of this franchise, from hatred to friendship to a bond that outlasts death itself, it is those two. Now to a harder truth about all of this, which is how much of it we only know because of stories told outside the original series and how much the show chose to leave blank on purpose. I want to be honest with you about how we even know most of what I have told you tonight because it matters and it is part of the afterstory too. Very little of what happens after the finale is shown in the original animated series itself. The show ends where it ends, with the war won and the friends together in a tea house. Almost everything else, the colony's crisis, the search for Ursa, Azula's unraveling, Toph's police force, the founding of Republic City, the fates of nearly everyone, comes from 2 other places. It comes from the canon comics, the graphic novels overseen by the show's own creators, which pick up the story roughly a year after the finale and carry it forward through the tangled early years of the piece. And it comes from the sequel series about the next Avatar, which leaps forward some 70 years and shows us these characters as elders, or tells us sometimes in a single line that they have died. That matters because it means the afterstory is scattered and uneven and full of deliberate holes. Some characters got rich, detailed continuations. Zuko, Toph, Aang, they were followed closely, given whole arcs, aged on screen. Others got a sentence, or a joke, or nothing at all. And I think it is worth naming that this unevenness is not really a failure. It is what happens when a story is beloved enough to keep being told across different media over many years by people trying to be careful with it. The creators filled in what they most wanted to explore, and they left other things open, sometimes because they had not decided, sometimes because they preferred the mystery, sometimes simply because there is only so much story anyone can tell. So when I have told you tonight that something is confirmed, I mean it appears in one of those canonical sources. And when I have told you that something is unknown, I mean the sources actually leave it blank, and I have tried very hard all the way through not to paper over those blanks with things that sound good but are not true. Now to the blanks themselves, because they are worth honoring. The unanswered questions are, in their own way, as much a part of what happened after the series as any confirmed fact. And I want to gather them together and face them honestly, because a story this large is defined partly by what it chose not to tell you. We have hit several of these along the way, and laid side by side, they form a strange and moving little constellation of silence. We do not know how Sokka died. We know only that he was there, alive and fighting at 74, defending a baby, and then gone before the next era began, with no cause, no scene, no year. We do not know the long-term fate of Suki, whether her life with Sokka lasted, whether they married or had children, because the story loved her enough to keep her around and then never gave her an ending. Just a creator's joke about the suburbs. We do not know who Zuko married or who the mother of his daughter Izumi was, because the canon simply never says, and the obvious guess of Mai is left tangled and unconfirmed. We do not know what became of Mai herself in the long run, only that she and Zuko loved and hurt and orbited each other and never quite resolved. We do not know what happened to little Momo, the lemur who rode on Aang's shoulder, because the canon draws a gentle blank over his last days. We do not know the exact deaths of Toph, or Katara, or Zuko, only that all three outlasted the others and were still alive at the very end of the story we have. Now, I could have filled every one of those gaps with something that sounded confident. It would have been easy, and a lot of videos do exactly that, stating fan theories as facts, inventing a cause for Sokka, marrying Zuko off, giving Momo a deathbed. But I would rather leave you with the truth, which is that these blanks exist, and that they are, in a way, a gift. They are the places where the story stays alive, where it keeps breathing, where every person who loves it gets to imagine their own version. A story that answered everything would be a closed box. A story with these particular silences in it is still open, still ours to wonder about, and I think the creators knew that. The truest thing I can tell you about what happened to some of these characters is that nobody knows, and that not knowing is its own kind of ending. The kind that lets you keep them alive a little longer in your own head. Now let me pull the whole cast together one last time and count who was still standing when the very end came. If you stand at the far edge of the whole saga, at the close of Korra's own story, some 74 years after the war ended, and you look back at the friends who once crowded that tea house, the tally is a moving one. Aang is long gone, the first to leave, dead for over 20 years by then, his soul already passed into Korra, and even his guiding voice now severed from the world. Sokka is gone in his quiet, unexplained way. And of the core group, that leaves 3 still breathing at the very end, 3 old survivors carrying the whole memory of the war between them. Katara, around 89, the widow and matriarch and healer of the South, the last one who was there in the ice at the very beginning. Toph, ancient and gleeful in her swamp, feeling the whole world through the mud. And Zuko, in his 90s, the old Fire Lord on his dragon, still riding out to defend the peace. 3 of them at the end out of the group of children who once saved the world. The rest had gone on ahead. And around those 3 survivors stands the next generation, fully grown now, the ones who inherited everything. Zuko's daughter Izumi on the Fire Nation throne. Toph's daughters, Lin running the police and Suyin ruling her metal city, reconciled at last. Aang and Katara's children, Bumi, the late-blooming airbender, Kaya, the wandering healer, and Tenzin, the keeper of the airbenders, with his own children, Jinora and Ikki, and Milo and Rohan, carrying the bloodline of the last airbender into a 4th generation. The people who fought the war became the old ones, and their children became the leaders, and their grandchildren became the future, exactly as it is supposed to go, exactly as it so rarely gets to go in a world that has known as much war as this one. I find the arithmetic of it almost unbearably human. You spend 3 seasons with a group of children, and if you follow them all the way to the end of everything the canon gives us, you watch most of them die on all kinds of schedules, and you watch 3 of them make it through to a great age, and you watch their children and grandchildren fill the world they emptied by leaving it. That is not a tragedy, and it is not a triumph. It is just a life, several lives, run all the way to their ends, which is a thing stories almost never have the patience or the courage to show you. Most stories end at the victory. This one had the nerve to keep going past the victory, through the marriages and the founding of nations and the raising of children and the slow arrival of old age and the deaths, one after another, until only a handful of white-haired elders were left to remember when the world was at war. That is a rare gift, and it is the whole reason a video like this can even exist. Now to what those long lives, taken together, actually left behind, and the strange position it put their children in. There is a bittersweet irony running under the whole next generation that I think is the smartest thing about the entire afterstory, and it is this. The children who saved the world grew up to become the establishment, and their own children and grandchildren spent the next era rebelling against the world they had built. Think about it. Aang, Zuko, Sokka, Toph, they were the young rebels, the underdogs, the ragtag group fighting an entrenched, powerful, oppressive system. And then they won, and they became the system. They founded the governments, the police forces, the councils, the institutions. They were the powerful, entrenched authority now, the older generation running things. And so, inevitably, the great conflicts of the next era are conflicts aimed squarely at what these heroes built. The tension between benders and non-benders that erupts into a full revolution in Republic City. That is a rebellion against a social order in which benders, people like our heroes, hold most of the power. The radicals who want to tear down the nations and governments, that is a rebellion against the very political structures Aang and Zuko and Sokka created. The heroes of the war built a world, and that world, like every world, turned out to be imperfect and unequal and frustrating to the people born into it, and those people pushed back against it, sometimes violently. Tenzin, Aang's son, spends much of his life defending institutions his father founded against people who see those institutions as the problem. The child of the great liberator becomes a defender of the establishment. That is how it always goes. Every generation of liberators becomes the next generation's authority to be questioned. I do not think the show means this cynically at all, and I do not either. I think it is one of the wisest things it has to say about what happens after you win. Winning does not create a perfect world. It creates a new world with new problems, and the people who won become responsible for those new problems, and their children judge them for it. And that judgment is not wrong, it is just the next turn of the same wheel. The war our heroes fought was about the divisions between four nations. The struggles their grandchildren fought were about the divisions between the powerful and the powerless within the world those heroes made. The fight does not end, it changes shape, and it hands itself down, and each generation inherits a world that is better than the one before and still not good enough, and has to decide what to do about that. Aang and his friends did not fix the world. Nobody fixes the world. They handed their children a better version of it than the one they were given and asked them to do the same, and that, in the longest possible view, is the only kind of victory that was ever actually on offer. Before I draw it fully together, let me walk you through the things they left standing, the places and objects that outlasted the people. One of the gentlest ways to feel the passage of all this time is to look at the things that remained after the people were gone. The places and objects scattered through the next era that are really monuments to the characters we have followed. The world of the next Avatar is secretly full of them, if you know to look. Start where we started, with that statue in the bay. In the harbor of Republic City stands a great statue of Aang, tall and serene with his staff, watching over the city he helped found. It sits on an island in the bay, a memorial to the Avatar who brought peace, and the people of the city pass it every day, most of them with only the vaguest sense of the boy it represents, the 12-year-old who was frozen in ice and woke up to save the world. Korra herself, arriving in the city for the first time, sees that statue of her own past life looking down at her, a stone Aang greeting the new Avatar he can no longer speak to. It is one of the great quiet images of the whole sequel, the new soul sailing in beneath the monument to the old one. Near that same city sits Air Temple Island, the home Tenzin built, a preserved pocket of air nomad life recreated in the shadow of a modern metropolis, where the traditions Aang saved are kept alive and eventually taught to a whole new generation of airbenders. That island is Aang's culture made solid, a living museum that became a living nation again. Across the world in the Earth Kingdom stands Zaofu, Suyin's shining city of metal, which is really a monument to Toph, the physical proof of what her invention could become, an entire metropolis that could not exist if a blind girl had not bent iron in a cage. And somewhere in the upper ring of Ba Sing Se for a long time stood the Jasmine Dragon, Iroh's tea shop. the small, warm place where a retired general found the peace that a lifetime of war had denied him. There are smaller things too, the kind you might miss. A pet dragon named Druk, carrying an old fire lord through the sky, is a living monument to the dragons his ancestors nearly wiped out, and to Zuko's lifelong effort to be better than his blood, a corporation called Cabbage Corp. Its very name a 2-generation-old joke about a ruined cart. A police force in metal armor, a governing council, an order of face-painted warriors, an order of secret masters, each one a fingerprint left by a specific person on a world that kept turning long after that person was dust. This is how the dead stay present across this whole saga, not as ghosts mostly, but as institutions and monuments and inherited names and objects that outlive their makers. The people leave, and the shapes they pressed into the world remain, and if you walk through the next era with your eyes open, you are walking through a landscape built entirely out of the choices of the children who won the war. Now to the one relationship that reaches across the whole gap, from the first avatar of this story to the last, through a single woman who loved them both. There is one thread I want to pull tight before I close, because it is the loveliest piece of continuity in the entire after story, and it runs through Katara. Katara loved Aang, she found him in the ice, she fought beside him, she married him, she raised his children, and she outlived him by decades, keeping his memory alive in the Southern Water Tribe long after he was gone. And then, in her old age, the new avatar was born in her own tribe, a headstrong little waterbender named Korra, the reincarnation of the very man Katara had loved and buried. And it was Katara who trained her. Stay with the strange grace of that for a moment. The woman who taught Aang to open his heart became the woman who taught Aang's next life to bend water. Katara stood in front of a small, fierce girl and saw, somewhere behind her eyes, the soul of her dead husband looking back. The same being she had loved as a boy, now a stranger in a new body who did not remember any of it. She could not have Aang back, but she could pour everything she knew into the child who carried his soul. And she did, becoming Korra's waterbending master and one of the steadiest presences in her early life. And later, when Korra was gravely hurt, poisoned, and broken, and unable to move, it was Katara, ancient now, who used her legendary healing to try to bring the young avatar back. The old widow bending over the wounded new life of the man she married, fighting to save him one more time in the only body he had left. I do not think there is a more subtly devastating relationship anywhere in this franchise than the one between old Katara and young Korra, precisely because of everything that goes unspoken inside it. Katara never gets to tell Aang the things she might still have wanted to tell him, but she gets to love his soul again anyway, across the gap of death and reincarnation, in the shape of a girl who will never know that her waterbending teacher was, once, her own wife in a life she cannot remember. The love did not end when Aang died at 66. It found a way to keep going, transformed and one-sided and no less real. An old woman devoting her last strength to the newest version of the person she had loved her whole life. That, more than any statue or institution, is what actually survived. Not just the world they built, but the love that ran through it, carried forward by the one who lived the longest, poured into the one who came next. Before I draw together, a few threads still deserve their own moment, and the first is one it would be dishonest to skip. Because the peace these heroes built was never simply accepted by everyone. It had enemies of its own. One thing the afterstory is very clear about is that winning the war did not mean the war's ideas simply died. All through the years that follow, the peace has to keep defending itself against people who never accepted it. And following that thread tells you something important about how hard the aftermath of any war actually is. The moment the fighting stopped, new factions rose who wanted, in one way or another, to drag the world back toward conflict. There were the loyalists to the old regime, people who could not bear that Ozai had fallen and that his soft, reformist son now sat on the throne. They organized, they schemed, they formed a society dedicated to restoring the old order. And for a time, even Azula was entangled with them, though her true aim turned out to be stranger than simple loyalty. Zuko spent a great deal of his early reign putting down exactly these people, his own citizens who wanted the empire back. And it made those years lonely and dangerous, a young ruler constantly guarding against his own nation's nostalgia for its worst self. There were the hardliners in the south, too, who reacted to the modernizing of the Water Tribe with fury. a violent faction that wanted to reject all outside influence and preserve a pure, unchanging tradition by force, and Katara and Sokka and their father had to face that anger down. And there were the seeds of something even larger, the Bender supremacists in the growing colonial town, a faction pushing the poisonous idea that Benders were simply superior to those born without bending, which foreshadowed the great social war of the next era. What strikes me about all of these is that they represent the different ways a piece can be attacked. Some wanted to go backward to the old empire. Some wanted to freeze the world in place and let nothing change. Some wanted to invent a brand new hierarchy, benders over non-benders, to replace the old one of nation over nation. And the heroes, now the guardians of the peace rather than the rebels against tyranny, had to stand against all of them, over and over for the rest of their lives. The work was never finished. That is maybe the least glamorous truth of the whole after story, and one of the truest. You do not win the war and then rest. You win the war and then spend the rest of your life defending the fragile thing you won from the people who would happily tear it down. And you do it while growing old, and you do it without the clear moral simplicity of the original fight, because now the enemy is not a foreign empire, but your own neighbors, your own citizens, your own sister. Peace, it turns out, is a harder and lonelier thing to protect than freedom was to win. Now to the thread that runs under everything, the one about parents and children. The more time you spend with the afterstory of this world, the more you notice that almost every single character we have followed is defined, in the end, by a relationship with a parent or a child. And the way those relationships resolve after the war is really the emotional core of everything. This is, underneath the bending and the war, a story about broken families slowly, imperfectly, trying to mend. Look at how many of them carry a wound from a parent. Zuko spends his whole life in the shadow of a father who scarred and banished him, and the great work of his adulthood is refusing to become that man, arranging his own execution rather than risk turning into Ozai, secretly visiting his father's cell and coming away poisoned, and finally raising a daughter, Izumi, who ends the family's cruelty for good. Azula carries the same father wound, and it destroys her because where Zuko fled from Ozai's approval, Azula organized her entire self around earning it, and when the approval turned out to be worthless, she came apart. Toph carries a mother and father who loved her but could not see her, who tried to keep her small and safe, and her whole life is an argument against them. And yet, in the years after the war, she reunites with her father at last, an old grievance finally softening. Katara and Sokka carry a father, Hakoda, who left them to fight the war, and they get him back and get to build the new South alongside him. And Zuko and Azula carry a mother, Ursa, who vanished, and the search for her is one of the great quests of the afterstory, ending in a reunion and a restored family and a little half-sister nobody knew about. And then watch how those same wounded children become parents themselves and how they do it differently. Aang, who lost his entire people and every parental figure he had, becomes a devoted father to 3 children and pours the whole of his murdered culture into the one who could carry it. Toph, whose parents smothered her, raises 2 fierce daughters and lets them become exactly as headstrong and independent as she was, to the point that they barely speak to each other. Zuko, son of a monster, raises a peacemaker. The generation that was hurt by its parents becomes a generation of parents trying, with mixed success, not to repeat the damage. Some of them manage it beautifully. Some of them pass down new versions of the same old struggles. All of them are shaped to the very end of their lives by the question of who raised them and who they raised. I think this is the real reason the afterstory lands as hard as it does. It is not really about what happened to a set of magical warriors. It is about what happens to a group of hurt children when they grow up. Whether they heal, whether they pass the hurt on or set it down, whether they become the parents they needed or the parents they feared. And the answer the story gives is the honest one, which is that it is a mixture, that some wounds close and some stay open and some get handed down anyway. And that trying to break the cycle is a lifelong job that nobody finishes perfectly. That is what these people spent their after years doing, every one of them, learning how to be someone's child and then learning how to be someone's parent, and mostly getting it a little more right than the generation before. Now to the second thread, a quieter story about a father and a daughter. in the town that became the greatest city in the world. There is a specific reunion in the post-war years that I glossed past earlier and want to give its proper due because it ties together several of the biggest threads at once. In the years after the war, Toph, who had run away from her wealthy family as a child and never looked back, comes face to face with her father again, Lao Beifong, the man whose control she fled. It happens at a place of industry, a refinery in the growing colonial town, where the old world of spirits and nature is colliding with the new world of factories and progress, and there is even an ancient, furious spirit stirred up by all the digging and building, angry at what the humans are doing to the land. And in the middle of that clash between the old and the new, the runaway daughter and the father she abandoned finally have to face each other. What makes it land is that neither of them has fully changed, and yet something between them does. Toph is still proud and prickly and unwilling to apologize for the life she chose. Lao is still a traditional man who never quite understood the daughter he had, but they find in that reunion a kind of grudging peace, an acknowledgement across the gap that had separated them for years. It is not a tearful, everything is forgiven reconciliation. It is something more true to both of them, two stubborn people deciding to stop being strangers. And it happens against the backdrop of that growing town, the very settlement that will, in the years to come, swell into Republic City, the capital of the new nation. So in a single arc, you get the healing of Toph's oldest wound and the birth pangs of the greatest city in the world, the personal and the historical braided together. A family mending in the exact spot where the future is being poured. I love that the story chose to put those two things in the same place. The city that becomes the center of the whole next era does not rise out of nothing. It rises out of a landscape where a spirit rages against industry, where a daughter and a father make an uneasy peace, where the old world and the new one grind against each other and something has to be worked out between them. That is the birthplace of the modern world in this saga. Not a battlefield, but a refinery town full of unfinished family business, and I think that is exactly right. The future always gets built on top of somebody's unresolved past. There is one last quiet pattern I want to point at before the summing up, and it is the way so many of these characters drifted in their later years toward the spiritual. It is easy to miss, but a surprising number of the people we have followed ended their lives more spiritually attuned than they began them, as if age in this world bends people gently toward the unseen. Iroh is the clearest case, a general who became a mystic and finally walked into the spirit world to stay. But look at the others. Toph, who was as down-to-earth as anyone the show ever gave us, the one who mocked anything she could not feel through her feet, ended her life as a hermit in the foggy swamp, that most spiritually charged of places, more deeply connected to the living energy of the world than she ever admitted she cared to be. Aang, spiritual to his core even as a boy, poured that depth into rebuilding the connection between the human and spirit worlds, and passed the gift down the bloodline until it bloomed again in his granddaughter Jainora, who could cross between worlds with an ease that startled even the masters around her. And the world itself turned spiritual again in the next era, the long closed door between the two planes thrown open, spirits walking among people once more after thousands of years of separation. I think there is something lovely and true in that drift. These were people who spent their youth entirely through the body, fighting, bending, running, building, all muscle and will and motion. And as they aged, many of them turned inward and upward toward stillness, toward the swamp and the tea shop and the spirit world, toward the parts of existence you cannot punch or bend or plan your way through. It is the natural arc of a long life, maybe. The slow turning from doing toward being, from conquering the world toward simply understanding it. The warriors became contemplatives, the fighters became, in their different ways, seekers. And the world grew quieter and stranger and more full of spirits around them as they did. Now let me draw all of it together, gently, and then let you sleep. When you lay all of these fates side by side, something interesting happens, because they sort themselves into a handful of very different shapes of ending, and I think naming those shapes is a lovely way to hold the whole thing in your mind as you drift off. Not everyone got the same kind of ending, and the variety of them is part of what makes this world feel so real. Some got the ending that comes too soon. Aang, most of all, the boy who saved the world and then died at 66 with a century of stolen life softly drained out of him by the ice, gone before his grandchildren, gone before the Airbenders returned. Gone before he could see most of what he built. His was the ending that arrives early and leaves the room full of everything the person did not get to see. Some got the ending wrapped in silence. Sokka, alive and fighting at 74, and then simply, unaccountably absent, with no cause and no scene, the man who always had a plan given no explanation at all. Suki, loved by the story, and then unceremoniously set down without a proper finish. Momo, the small bright creature the canon gently declined to follow to his last day. These are the endings made of blank space, the ones where the honest answer is that we were never told, and the not telling became the ending itself. Some got the ending that comes very late and is all the richer and lonelier for it. Katara, 89 and widowed and still healing, the last witness to the whole war. Toph, ancient and cackling in her swamp, having outrun everything she built. Zuko, in his 90s on a dragon, still answering the call. These three got the long ending, the one that lets you see a whole life all the way through, with all the loss and all the endurance that a long life carries, the friends buried one by one, and the world remade past recognition and the stubborn refusal, even so, to stop caring. Some got the ending that is really a transformation. Iroh, who did not so much die as relocate, stepping through into the spirit world to keep pouring tea forever. Yu, who became the moon and hangs over every night that follows. Ursa, who was erased and chose to remember, remade twice and finally restored. Aang himself, in the deepest sense, who did not end at all but became Korra, the soul continuing into a new life. For these, death was not a wall but a door, an entrance into some other kind of continuing. And some got the ending that stays open on purpose, the wound that will not close, the redemption that never quite arrives. Azula, above all, brilliant and broken and never cleanly healed, left mid-struggle because the honest truth of a child turned into a weapon does not resolve in a tidy arc. Mai, tangled and unfinished. These are the endings that refuse to be endings, the ones that respect the character too much to lie about how hard some things are to fix. Laid out that way, the whole after-story becomes a kind of meditation on all the different ways a life can close. The early death, the silent death, the long twilight, the transformation, the open wound. And I think the reason this world feels so much deeper than most is that it was brave enough to give its beloved characters all of these different endings instead of the single, tidy, happy ever after that a lesser story would have handed out to everyone equally. Real people end in all these different ways. So did these. Now let me pull back all the way one last time, and then I will let you go to sleep. There is one more after story worth telling, and it is not the characters but the show's own, because the story of what happened to Avatar, the last airbender in our world after it went off the air, is nearly as remarkable as anything that happened inside it. The original series ran for 3 seasons and ended its broadcast with the finale in the summer of 2008, and at the time it was a beloved but not enormous show. A critically praised animated series with a devoted following. Nobody watching that finale air could have predicted the size of the shadow it would eventually cast. Almost everything I have told you tonight comes from the years after that broadcast ending. The canon comics, which continued the story under the creator's supervision, began arriving a few years later and kept coming across the following decade, filling in the colony's crisis and the search for Ursa and all the rest. The sequel series about the next Avatar arrived a few years after that, giving us the elderly versions of these characters and the world they built. And then, years later still, something happened that almost never happens to a finished animated show. It found an entirely new and much larger audience. When the series arrived on streaming, a whole generation who had missed it the first time discovered it all at once, and it became improbably a genuine cultural phenomenon, more popular in its afterlife than it had ever been on the air. And more recently, the world of Avatar has kept expanding into novels that deepen its history, into new animated projects in development, into a live-action adaptation that brought these characters to a mainstream audience all over again. I mention all of this because it rhymes with the theme of everything we have talked about. The show, like Aang, was frozen for a while, quiet, waiting, and then it woke up into a world that had grown ready for it. And it turned out to be far more important than anyone realized while it was actually happening. The after story of Avatar in the real world is a story about a thing that got bigger after it ended that meant more in hindsight. That a new generation of people fell in love with long after its makers thought they were finished. That is a rare and lovely fate for any piece of art, and it is the reason a channel like this one can spend 2 quiet hours in the dark, walking through the lives of these characters and know that somewhere out there, plenty of you are listening with your eyes closed, holding these people as dearly as I do. Now truly, let me pull it all together and let you rest. When I step all the way back from every fact and every fate we have laid out tonight, what stays with me is not any single ending. It is the sheer, patient completeness of it. The way this world had the nerve to follow its children all the way to the ends of their lives and beyond, into the lives of their children and their children's children, and the new Avatar who was the oldest of them reborn. Most stories give you a victory and a freeze frame. This one gave you a victory and then 80 more years, the marriages and the founding of nations and the quiet deaths and the statues in the bay. It let its heroes grow old. It let them be imperfect rulers and distant parents and lonely survivors. It let some of them die young and some of them die unexplained, and some of them simply disappear into the fog. And in doing all of that, it turned a story about a boy who could bend the elements into something much larger and much truer, a story about how a whole generation carries the weight of the world for a while, and builds what it can, and then lays it down and hands it to the next. That, in the end, is what happened to every Avatar character after the series ended. They lived, fully, unevenly, sometimes joyfully, and sometimes in silence. They lived the rest of their lives, and then, one by one, on all their different schedules, they let those lives go, and the world they had saved kept turning without them, carrying their names and their inventions and their cities and their love forward into a future they would never see. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what happens to all of us, only they got to do it in a world with dragons. If you have stayed with me all the way to here, thank you truly for spending this long, quiet stretch of the night in this world with me. There is something fitting about ending a video like this half asleep because the whole saga of Avatar is, underneath everything, a story about letting go with grace, about accepting that things end and trusting that what you built will outlast you. Aang understood that from the very first episode, the boy who was always just passing through, and I think if you have drifted somewhere warm and dim while I have been talking, you have understood it too in your own way tonight. The war ended a long time ago, the heroes are mostly gone now, and the world they left behind is still out there, still turning, still full of their fingerprints, waiting for you whenever you want to go back and visit. It will keep, so will they. Rest now. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.